Shoot. Go
Hello,
ahead.
welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Michael Lachanski. He's a PhD student currently in the Demography and Sociology program at the University of Pennsylvania. He is interested in the study of long-run policy changes to education, immigration, and crime with an eye to contemporary social problems. He's interested in the application of reproducible methods from data science, transparent computational methods, and modern econometrics to study problems in economic, demography, and social stratification. Currently, he is studying the single and intergenerational effects of compulsory schooling and the effects of immigration restrictions on specific causes of death. Additionally, Michael is a contributor on a project that aims to understand how individuals in declining occupations navigate the US changing occupational structure. He holds an MPA with a focus on economic policy and population and an AB in economics, both from Princeton University. So welcome, Michael, to the podcast.
Great to see you, Larry. Interesting connection.
Yeah. So well, maybe we should start with that. So we met each other at it was an ASA, so the American Sociological Association, a social mixer with the Princeton graduates, and we had a nice little chat from there, and then it sort of grew into an online connection. But and I hope we're gonna meet in person soon as well for lunch. Also, okay. So there's a lot of papers that you have done. You're incredibly productive. I mean, I can see. I mean, there's a lot of projects down the pipeline, but maybe we should start with your own family background. Obviously, you're from New Jersey, right? In Linden.
I'm from New Jersey. I was born in Rahway and I grew up in the Linden, Elizabeth area.
Yeah, these names are all ringing a bell with me, not because I was actively in those cities, but I take the NJ Transit to visit friends in New York City, getting off at New York Penn Station. But those are definitely stops along the way. And also when I go to the airport, the New York airport also passes by. So how is it like? I mean, growing up in the streets, I guess, in Linden, Rahway. You also went to school there throughout, and then before you went to Princeton.
It's a little bit of a complicated story. I dropped out of high school. I went to the Union County Magnet High School. I knew I didn't want to be an engineer, and basically from there, it's an engineering vocational school. The big advantages to going to this particular school would be that if you were to continue on to Rutgers University, you would shave maybe 1.5, 2 years off of the time to BA. And I knew that I didn't want to be an engineer. So those advantages for me were pretty neutral. And I realized that actually many universities in the US don't really care that you have a high school diploma or not. They actually do often. At the time I was, navigating this transition, they would allow you to apply your junior year. They had all these other like strange pathways. This is particularly true when you get to the top 10, 15, maybe for some state R1 flagships, it's a little bit more restrictive, but for sure within the US, a high school diploma was not required for attendance. And so that basically kind of settled the matter for me that I had no real desire to complete the degree. And so I dropped out and I was like looking for things to do such that I wouldn't be wiped out. I actually attended community college, Union County College. I did a few classes there. I considered attending early at Rutgers. Rutgers has, again, a program that just allows you to start doing basically college from your junior year onwards. And I discovered something called United World College, which was this set of programs sponsored, I guess, by Arm & Hammer and a few other, more or less wealthy donors. And the point of the United World College system is to put together originally people from around the world, but I guess a focus on getting people from the East Bloc, people from maybe more closed countries together to complete high school, with a multicultural focus and to have diverse roommates and different kinds of experiences, things like that. That was kind of the point of the United World College program. because the world has become so much more open, and I think that that kind of experience of having a diverse high school, especially for private elite high schools, has become so much more common. They've tried to differentiate in other ways, a focus on sustainable development and things like that. But I was interested in that when I was 16, 17. And so that was what I wound up doing after dropping out. And then from there, I did undergrad at Princeton, grad school at Princeton, now doctoral program at Penn. So that's kind of my educational trajectory. From Linden, Elizabeth, I don't have many, I don't have many recollections or things that contributed to my, I'll say, intellectual development. These are kind of, Linden especially was kind of a declining industrial town. It had a very large General Motors plant that I think provided a lot of the, let's say, middle skill work for men. And when that plant shut down, which was when I had to be 10 to 15 years old, that occupational pathway closed for many people. And it's kind of unclear what cities like that and small towns like that are going to do. So I do have something I've never really had time to pursue, but I'm very interested in like declining cities and where people are going to be in 100 years. And it just turns out that small area population forecasting is an active area of methodological research in demography, but it's by no means like a completed project to the extent that you would expect, given, you know, how useful this is, how much it's actually used in the public sector. It's like one of the number, it's got to be in the top 3 or 4 things that demographers are wanted for in the public and private sector is basically small area forecasting. What's going to happen to my city in 100 years? What's going to happen to my city in 50 years? Yet there's surprisingly few tools or guidelines, or this is the perfect way to do that. But that kind of thing has always been in the back of my mind when I think about demography and what demographers do and what demographers can do. And in fact, this year, I'm hoping to have a little bit of time to put together some tools in an R package to make a lot of basically the small area forecasting stuff more routine, more canned, to make it so you can press a button into it and not need to manage these like large, unwieldy Excel spreadsheets, which I think might be the bane of many urban planners in America today who actually have to do some of these forecasts. So that's something I'm hoping to do this year, but it's truly public service. It's hard to think. In academia, there's a colleague of mine at Penn, Jacob Kaplan, who says that there's a big anti-data bias. And I would actually say that I think when you get to the top level, it's true there is an anti-data bias, but there's also an anti-public goods bias. There's a lot of things in infrastructure that academics provide that gets far more cited than the average publication, which I think people know the statistics on this. Something like, you know, 1/3 of World Bank's reports will basically never be cited, and these are public facing and intended basically for public consumption. They're not going to be cited once, and it might be something like another fraction, maybe between 10 and 50%, will not even be downloaded once outside of the World Bank headquarters. So there's the average academic paper attracts remarkably little interest. And yet the returns on that for your CV are just far higher than they are for making pieces of public goods or making public goods that might be like the glue that holds, for instance, a lot of projects together. So I'm thinking, for instance, of IPython. That was originally an academic project, grew out of, I think, a UC Berkeley group. If you look at many of the people involved, they were disgruntled academics, so I don't think got much. I don't know what happened to them, but I think career-wise, they got very little benefits for having done that. And yet it'd be extremely valuable and I think extremely useful to have simply a unit that full-time tries to make open source software for people. Instead, it just becomes like something you do as a side project that in this case is inspired a little bit by, I think, the experience of Linden, which was one of these towns that economically, if you were going to like restructure the US, it might not even exist, right? A lot of these towns came together because they had a factory that was put there in 1930, because they had a small population there. And it's unclear that you would want a city there if you were thinking from scratch. And the economic demographer's intuition is that we're slowly converging to that situation. So I think many of these cities and towns are going to be abandoned in the US in the future. And but it's a shame there's no projections to suggest that that's like an informed opinion. That's just my feeling.
It's another personal question. So do you think that you might have ended up working at the GM plant? I mean, if it had still been open, because I mean, from your biography, it seems to be that, you know, you went to community college, you went to a special high school program before you came to Princeton. But yeah, do you think that you know, that this would have been an option? I mean, to be working at the GM plant?
Realistically, I guess, let me think about it. Yeah, realistically, in some kind of managerial role, yeah. But both of my parents were college educated. My mother, had some training in like linguistics and psychometrics and computer science. She worked as some kind of computer programmer for the city government. My father worked in some kind of food science position before discovering, which I think many maybe would-be academics do, that there's more money in sales. And I think basically that, I'm not going to say that my family, we lived in a working class area. That is for sure true. But I suspect that a lot of it, I think, came about because, people get married and they get very physically tired when they have married and they have kids. It becomes very hard to relocate, for instance, if you have 2 or 3 kids. I think if my parents had the benefits of foresight, they might not have chosen the neighborhood that I grew up in, which I think in many ways was not, it was not Newark. There's definitely, it's an area, I think, I looked it up on Chetty's map. I think it's an area of average social mobility. You might be able to argue about edge cases and how valid those maps are, but people from there are not severely disadvantaged. I just think that it's not a place where there was high upward mobility compared to, what it once was. And there are many people I know, I guess, of my friends from that neighborhood, I think none had gone to college of the friends that I was close with. But we knew one person on the block over who had gone to college, and we knew other people who at least attempted to go to college. And my feeling is that a lot of this transition is kind of been well documented in other places in the sociology literature. So for instance, in economic sociology, economic demography, I'm thinking in particular of the deindustrialization of America by Bluestone and Harris. I think it's Bluestone and Harrison. That was written in 1980. That was written in the early 1980s, and I think published around 1982. So the idea that that kind of life course was not going to be sustainable, that was known by policymakers years and years and years ago. And by the time I come of age, like 20 years has passed. And to have a city that's trying to rely on a large production plant to be the major source of employment for high school graduates, it's not a workable urban plan. And I think a lot of urban planners who think that there's going to be like an industrial revival in the US, or that that's going to be a major source of employment, I think that is an error. And I think it could be a catastrophic error for some cities. I don't know. Like Linden, I know in particular, was relying on tax revenue from the General Motors plant. And all this stuff is now 10 years old, 15 years old. And they were relying on tax revenue, and that was how they sustained public services. So this is a very common problem in small and medium-sized towns. But for myself, I think in some ways we were kind of misplaced in some ways. And an I think about my sister. She'd also gone to Penn, and basically, I think that I don't know, I don't want to say destined for upward mobility, but I'm sure we would have done things that moved us out of that neighborhood. If you look at neighborhoods that are often on the downward trajectories, often they're on downward trajectories in large part because their tax base is moving away. And I don't want to say anything about Linden like the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, this was my feelings of the town around the time of the Great Recession and a few years before, was that this was not a place where you could go and maybe have a life. It was not going to be a major source of jobs, in the 21st century. But I guess my point here is that many of those changes were known in advance. I think my family knew about it. I think growing up, I remember hearing in elementary school, like, hey, life is going to be much harder for you kids because there's going to be competition with China and globalization, all this kind of stuff. People had a very vague sense of what that meant, I think, even in the early 2000s. And there was a robust anti-globalization movement at that time. I think that was basically created by those fears. And so you ask whose responsibility is it to address that? I certainly think it's the responsibility of urban planners circa that time to not be betting your future on one large industrial plant, but that was what my town did. And so I think that that is something I keep in the back of my mind, although that's not really that has tangential connections to my research. So for instance, one project I'm working on is on declining occupations. There are many occupations in the US that are like physically shrinking in size, and that actually forces the workers out of them. And we have to ask the question, where do these workers wind up? And in many cases, it seems that workers from shrinking occupations are on downwardly mobile trajectories. It's not surprising. Maybe more surprising is that people who are in growing occupations, they basically also are on upwardly mobile trajectories, which is kind of a little bit surprising. You wouldn't expect that correlation to exist, but it does. And this is all preliminary results. I mean, we can talk about the published paper. These things take 5 years to publish nowadays. I mean, that's the other thing about pipeline and productivity, is how long a lot of these things take. But okay, that's a little bit of a rant and has taken us away from your question.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, so just a point about your own family background here is quite interesting, right? Because you seem to have the social capital that comes from within your own family. Your parents are college graduates, and they would presumably impart certain values upon you that the education is good and worthwhile pursuing. It's going to be for your own benefit. But then at the same time, you also say that the people that you grew up with in your neighborhood, only some of them have attended college.
I would say a minority.
Yeah, a minority. So I mean, how was it like growing up? I guess I mean, were you sort of saying, well, my parental influence is going to be the main one, and I'm going to persevere.
And neighborhood influence would be a little bit smaller, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess,
how
what to say about this? So one thing I'll say is it was not certain that I would attend college. I was not dead set on that. I thought about joining the army and stuff like that. I mean, I was open to many other career paths, I think, when I was younger. And there were career paths that were opening. I mean, I didn't feel like there was a shortage of jobs. But what there was kind of a shortage of careers. I mean, that's one good thing about the US, is that the US has an enormous number of jobs that require less education. They just turn out usually not to be good career paths. And what do we make of that? Well, it has upsides and downsides. I guess it's better that these jobs are available than that they're not. And for me, I would say that when I was 18, 19, kind of making these decisions, it's not the case that I was dead set on going to college and everyone had this expectation that I would wind up where I wound up. I think that I knew a lot of people who I think were, now equally talented, who knows, but they were similar to me. And they did not attend college. So I think there's definitely a neighborhood. There are neighborhood and institutional effects. And I guess if I had to make up a statistical, kind of argument, I would say that parental influence in this case was just stronger than the neighborhood effect. But yeah, I know many people who I think could have succeeded in college. They could have gone on to have a white collar career, and they just didn't. And that's almost an ethnographic. I think that's something where my own insights into the matter are a little bit limited. I mean, what I would say about people now I have to think of my friends' career trajectories. Okay, one person, he wound up in a union, and then for him that was it. Basically, he got his $25 an hour with like max benefits, and he works exactly 40 hours a week, and then that's it. That worked out well for him. That system, they have one job opening every 2 years. His dad knew a guy. That's the end of his career story, and that took place, I think, probably 24, 25 for him. Okay, that's one person. Another person worked kind of odd jobs all over the place. He's very affable, very intelligent. I think he could have done at least, community college, probably could have gone to the state flagship. And that person is still, doing odd jobs and helping his dad out. But in that case, the father has a big pension, and it's not like this person is going to be in any danger of kind of poverty because he's connected in some ways. That's another case. So a lot of these cases, there's something very interesting that's happening, I think, with US incomes, where a lot of people are now picking up these like side gigs, and through these kinds of side gigs, they're patching together, in some cases, on a global scale, like sizable sources of income. So you can find people in data who seem to be working 3 jobs and then they make 80,000 a year. That puts them probably in the global top 10%. And
But they're
maybe
also
top
stressed out,
5%.
right? Because
They're
if
stressed
you
out, right? So the U.S.
two
is not
jobs.
a healthy, right? Yeah. So people talk about this with the U.S. I saw one tweet or something that said like the U.S. is like a rich death trap because globally, the 50th percentile in the U.S. does very well. The 70th percentile in the U.S., even the 40th percentile of the U.S. makes like far more money than even in say France or Germany. Even when you try to account for transfers, the more generous transfer packages in some of those countries. On the other hand, the mortality outcomes and many of these other social problems that afflict them are not great. And so there is a question about having a different regime type. Maybe the US is just going to be of this regime type that tries to generate income. And in doing so, it creates, lots of stress. It creates medical uncertainty, it creates family uncertainty. And navigating those things, I think, is going to be an increasing problem in like the 21st century for just citizens and individuals.
Right. And so that, raises the importance of, welfare state. And I mean, like one of the things I noticed, like when I went to Vienna this past summer, was that, there's much more of a sense of leisure culture, right? Because I mean, people are working 40-hour work weeks, and then you have like cafes and a lot of street corners, and it's always the same people that you see sitting in these cafes, versus over here it's like, yes, there's a lot of places where you can get caffeine, but it's so like a Starbucks, or Dunkin' Donuts takeout, and then just go back to work, basically go back to your office. And it's a much I don't know, a much more severe kind of work focused culture, and like a Protestant work ethic, you could say, if you go back to the Weber, which is much more developed over here. And yet, I mean, if you look at the social indicators, I mean, things like health, longevity, yeah, there's a lot of industrialized countries that are doing much better than the U.S. in terms of longevity and health into high age. I mean, one thing, for instance, I mean, in Austria, I know that there is a real sense of retirement, right, where it's like basically where the state decides, when your pensionable age is, and then you pay into the system as long as you're an adult. But then, when the transition to the retirement comes, right? So when you get your state pension, then the normative expectation is you're done with the labor market, right? Like there's no such thing as, oh well, I still have energy, so I'm gonna go be a dog greeter at Walmart or something like that, right? Or I still do several odd jobs because otherwise I cannot afford the, I don't know, prescription medication, because Medicare only pays a part of the fees. So yeah, so I think that, yeah, there's a much greater sense of leisure culture in the European countries, because of the welfare state institutions. And that doesn't sound to be too bad. Now, I mean, but then the flip side, some people say, well, okay, if you look at the overall tax burden, I mean, it is true that like if you're like a middle income earner in many European countries, 45, 50% of the income is going into the state taxation. And then, and also there's very high like value added taxes for everything you consume. And you're not going to have as much of that over here. Maybe, it's like 30%, maybe sort of the average tax burden. So you get to keep more of your money. But I don't know. I mean, it's a big question. I mean, is money the only thing that matters in life? I guess it's I mean,
I don't know if like if a sociologist or a demographer is like the right person to ask about that. I think that most people would just say no. But then the question becomes sort of like who decides? I mean, that I think is the more realistic trade-off. I mean, it's very difficult. For instance, a state where you get money for retirement, that's often complemented with things like mandated retirement laws that actually restrict workers on like opportunities in old age. And that I think is a maybe more interesting ethical question, because they argue that they're making space for younger workers. That's a very common argument. So I know that, for instance, India has laws like this on the books, which are sometimes enforced. And the US used to have a lot more mandated retirement ages. And my own suspicion is that in many cases, just having alternative sources of income for elderly people, that's probably just to their benefit and probably also to society's benefit. Nobody should be forced to work, is I think is something that many academics agree with. I don't have much to say about what the right trade-off is for the society. You might argue that if you have a free immigration system between Austria and the US, it would actually be best to have both, and then let workers kind of sort into the system that they prefer. And in fact, there are people, I think everyone knows cases of people who have traveled to Europe and become full-time workers there from the States because they like the lifestyle. But I know one academic who went to Sweden, for instance, because he felt angry at the US's high levels of inequality. And I think that is a sentiment that you find sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's right. I mean, integrating, across space. I think. I mean, especially with over the Atlantic, might be a little difficult. I mean, obviously, I've made that transition. I mean, going from there to over here. Because
Well, the UK, for instance, has a visa. So you might say that the UK, there might be something very specific, like you might like the NHS. Well, the UK now has a visa that says that if you graduated from some top 30 universities, top N universities, you can now basically travel to the UK, and they'll give you a visa for 5 years to look for a job. You don't have to have the job in hand. And so I think things like that are going to become more and more common. I think the way a lot of countries are thinking about this is that the benefits of restricting certainly like many types of immigration, I think are low. And so I think that this kind of welfare states in the global, in global competition with each other, I do think that's going to become a theme of social science in the 21st century. I'm thinking a little bit of S. Being Anders right now. He has this, the three welfare state scheme, right? Do you remember this? Where one is the liberal, one's the conservative, and then one is the,
social democratic.
yeah, it's like liberal, social democratic. And then there's one, I think, for like the Mediterranean countries, let's say. Maybe that's the conservative, I'm not sure. It's universal, right? It's universal, and then there's liberal, and then there's like this family-oriented one. And the liberal one would be like the UK, the US. And what's unfortunate about this kind of framework is that, well, South Korea and Japan, they have kind of different welfare state setups. So then so scholars will sometimes add them and then call that the East Asian model of social
Confucian,
welfare.
I think is
Confucian is something you hear sometimes, yeah. And I think what I think a lot of these things miss is that many of these welfare states are kind of influenced by each other in different ways. And in some ways, for instance,
it's like a policy learning thing.
Yeah, there's a policy learning thing. And so the idea of stable regimes, when, for instance, Germany is copying certain aspects of the US, and the US is, of course, we're constantly trying to copy aspects of Europe. I don't know like how robust these kinds of categories are. And I guess a second kind of criticism I might have is that they're often very circular. So like, for instance, it is true that South Korea and Japan are very different in what they're trying to do, for instance, single mother provisions, than in, say, the US. But then that just raises the question, what's the value of this kind of classification system? If every time I see one that's like a little bit different, my previous classifications don't work, and I have to have this concept stretching over time. And I think that basically with globalization, many of these kinds of ways that we think about the welfare state are going to be concept stretched. So for instance, this paper I wrote for, I co-authored for Capitalism and Society, this journal, basically it wound up becoming a shorter paper in the Niskanen Center. And the Niskanen Center is this kind of, let's say, neoliberal, market-oriented, center-left think tank. And basically what they do is they try to think of a lot of these, how can we adapt the US welfare state to globalization type of concern? So for instance, I'll give one example. The unemployment insurance in the US basically was designed at a time when most people, worked for an employer. Maybe they weren't necessarily self-employed. And now we have this economy where people have 3 separate side gigs, none of which would actually qualify for unemployment insurance by themselves. So is it the case that this person should not be insured in the case of a recession? Another way of thinking about it is maybe what we're really trying to insure is income. And so maybe what we should be trying to think about, instead of recoding one of the problems, by the way, with this implementation of unemployment insurance was literally that the way that the programs that run the insurance scheme are a little bit old. So during COVID-19, when there were too many people requesting insurance at once, they had to have people recode and update the COBOL scripts.
So some of the sites
these
crashed, right?
Yeah. The sites were crashed. So they had to update the COBOL scripts that these states actually use for administering payments. And it turns out almost all COBOL programmers are old. And my mom was programmed in COBOL, so she got something from the governor of New Jersey, who was requesting old COBOL programmers to come in to work for free. And she was like, hell no. But that's kind of a problem that I think occurs when you're stuck in the current framework. But if you were just to look at things like, how can we just ensure your income? Well, then it becomes very automatic. Then it becomes, okay, we can just staple this on as a state tax. And we just look at basically what your income was for that year from all sources. We wrap everyone into this net. It's very, very difficult to escape. It becomes something that basically the self-employed and people who have run small businesses, they would also have access to. That's the kind of thing that they're trying to do to try to adapt to the way that labor markets are changing. So that's the kind of project that I think I'm personally very sympathetic to, is that many times state policy and national policy has not really kept up with some of the challenges that actual workers on the ground are facing. And if it's possible to adapt these systems, often at no cost, I mean, often it would save you money to do things like this, or you would even have a higher source of revenue because it might be that small business owners will very rarely need to dip into the income insurance. There's many things like that that make these things essentially neutral in terms of their fiscal policy impacts, but more adaptable when catastrophes like COVID-19 actually happens. That's the kind of project I'm very, very sympathetic to.
I think especially the COVID shock is quite interesting because the Chinese are saying the crisis is a very it would be very bad to waste it, right? And I mean, like for instance, we had the Paycheck Protection Program, right, where the government all of a sudden takes a lot of money to ensure that businesses don't go under, right? So make it easy to apply for state loans, and in some cases, I guess those loans are being waived. The business doesn't come back immediately, and then I guess the main idea was to sustain the payroll, because the government doesn't want to have too many unemployed people at once, and I think it's usually during these crisis moments that we see, well, we need the government now to step in, and that's happened across all of the at least developed countries, the ones who already have welfare state infrastructure built up, and it can be very effective, and so I don't know. I mean, even if you read The Economist nowadays, I mean, which is usually we need free markets kind of narrative, but they're actually quite favorable now to have the state sort of come in and at least provide some levels of social protection, and so as I think the COVID crisis might be result in more favorable views to its a powerful protective state, but then I don't know. I mean, if but then if you saw like the new prime minister in the UK, right? It was like Liz Truss. I mean, he came in, and then the chancellor brought in a new budget recently, where they were saying, well, okay, now we should give more money to, the rich, tax breaks to them, and then the deficits go up, and then they say, oh well, now we have to cut the social budgets, even though inflation is elevated, right? And then you have the pound dropping, right? You have the interest rates going up because there's too much money now that's being pumped into the economy in an inflationary setting, war, supply chain shortages, etc. And of course Brexit. So I'm not sure. I mean, maybe. Yeah, I guess politics is a messy process, right? There's a hope that the pandemic would open up I don't know, more state friendly welfare state friendly perspectives, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I think people are very skeptical of the paycheck protection program on a per dollar basis. There's a good paper by Chetty that finds basically for the cost of, because the basic economic principle is that you want to ensure incomes and consumption, not particular institutions, right? We're not really wedded to the idea of there being this many small businesses in the area. We're kind of more wedded to the idea that people's consumption doesn't fall very low. That's kind of the basic economistic principle. So I think economic analyses of the Paycheck Protection Program have been very skeptical about its per dollar efficaciousness. That doesn't mean that there was no stimulus from it or that it had no impact on consumption trajectories. But in terms of how much money you spent versus how much you could have basically preserved people's consumption and incomes, probably they could have done much better via, say, direct payment. Something very.
You're saying that the money should go to individuals and to workers?
Yeah, and to individuals who are at risk of having their consumption fall below a certain level, rather than to small businesses. Because why? Because basically small businesses might not be the most efficient way of providing whatever goods and services are needed in the pandemic situation. It might be that some of them actually should go bankrupt to deal with the pandemic, but what you really want to preserve, your actual policy target and policy interest, should be something much more like individual consumption, individual income. That's kind of a common economistic critique of the Paycheck Protection Act. I think that because you might want it to be the case, for instance, that three businesses become one business, or that they buy each other out. That could be very efficient in adapting to the pandemic and eventually post-pandemic life. And I guess the other concern with that is that the farther you get away from individual payments, the more you open yourself up to cronyism. For instance, that there were many cases of like, well, there's a hedge fund that qualified for paycheck protection because it was a small business or something like that. That's a very common situation. I don't know
by
how
having direct relationships with the regulators who were making.
That's true as well. But in many cases, they had simply filled out the paperwork correctly, and they were small business, and they did qualify, and they did have workers that they were at risk of laying off. There was nothing wrong on paper with what they were doing, but it obviously wasn't the intention of the program itself. I'm not sure how big a deal the second and third things are compared to the first. I have no doubt that there was a little bit of that, as there is with any program. But the first concern, I think economists have done some calculations that suggest that, because if you're going to spend $800 billion, you want to do it efficiently. And I think that people should learn from this for the next catastrophe, which will hopefully be further away rather than sooner. But I think that people should try to learn about basically, what it is you're trying to do with these policies in a catastrophe. And that's what, again, another opportunity to shill for like income insurance. That would be the kind of thing that would happen automatically under an income insurance scheme. That might be quite difficult to do under something like Paycheck Protection Act, or the kind of scheme that we have in the US where you have unemployment insurance, but then we have other services that you qualify for when your income and wealth fall below a certain level. So that's basically.
So how does your income insurance scheme diverge from the contemporary unemployment insurance program?
Well, right now, unemployment insurance doesn't include many categories of income, and often it applies for full-time workers. And so what you would want is actually people who are even earning part-time, but they're working multiple part-time jobs, or they're self-employed. You would want them to at least be eligible for some kind of income insurance. That way that when their incomes fall below a certain level, maybe the government can make up 50% of them. That would be the kind of thing that I would be very interested in terms of where things should go in the future. And the reason for that is basically because you want these categories of income to be insured. And most people don't want their incomes to fall. I mean, the perverse incentive that also exists with unemployment insurance is that people will intentionally get themselves fired from jobs they don't like. Similarly, you can imagine with an income insurance, people might say, well, my income was way too low this year, because they just want to collect insurance. But in the case of income insurance, that could actually just be an okay outcome. It might be that you want people to behave in this kinds of way during hard economic times. So that's kind of my single proposal that I want to pitch, that people should be much more open to these ideas of trying to protect individual incomes and consumption rather than existing institutional arrangements. That's I think the normal economistic take on welfare.
Isn't there also going to be a problem where, I mean, if you have powerful employers who, they could be paying, higher wages, but they say, well, okay, now we have this income insurance scheme provided by the state, and so my incentive is to pay as little as possible. Now, I mean, I guess in the most idealized labor market version, whether it be competition for labor, then the lowest paying employer basically is not going to get any workers. But I'm not sure whether the labor market works as perfectly as that. And if they said, well, if we all decide to pay very little, then the income insurance pitches in. So basically, it would have to come out of the general tax revenues of middle or upper middle class workers.
The exact same calculation with health insurance. I mean, it's the exact same with any government provided benefit, is that they basically can say, well, we can pay you less because this is provided by the state. So I don't see this as fundamentally different. I just see it basically as, do you want to insure particular institutional arrangements, in this case, a job? I mean, they should really call unemployment insurance job insurance, because it's targeting a particular institutional arrangement in which an employee works for an employer. I don't see the downsides you're bringing up, which I think are definitely possible downsides, as that different fundamentally from any other welfare state schema in which the state provides a benefit.
Yeah,
in fact, that does happen. Yeah, in fact, that does happen. For instance, there's famous cases of Walmart where they tell you how to get Medicaid, at least when you're first starting out, because your salary comes in at $25,000 a year in Tennessee. And they say, okay, well, at this salary, you qualify for Medicaid. We'll make that easy for you. They're providing their workers with a service. And someone might reasonably argue, well, in the absence of Medicaid, it might be the case that Walmart would be forced to pay you more. People can argue things like that. And that could just be totally true. And then it becomes a matter of policy choice and political choice. You might want to have a model in which you have something more laissez-faire, in which you rely on competition between firms, and just overall high levels of wages, and that becomes how you support the less educated part of the market. Some people have argued for that. Some others have argued that you should provide state benefits for the low end part of the market, and at the cost that your firms will attempt to exploit that because they're profit seeking. So I don't see this as fundamentally different.
Yeah, but I would say for the healthcare market, I would say we know that it doesn't work really well, and I think that the European countries or even the Canadians who basically shift the payment model from private insurance companies to the state insurance. So basically, they only have one state insurance provider, and every person, I mean, whether you're employed or not, is covered under that program. I think that would be a much better system. Because I mean, you always have the problem, like, like, let's say if you are a well-paid U.S. worker with a very good health insurance plan, but then you decided, well, do I want to take, let's say, a lower paid job, but I'd be more passionate in doing that, or do I want to open up my own business? But all of these choices are going to be impacted by the lack of quality, affordable healthcare, and the fact that well, if I have good healthcare with the current employer, I'm not going to switch my employer, and I
I
guess
mean,
that
this is a theoretical argument that I don't know has found that much support in empirical tests of it. I mean, it makes sense to me, like what you're saying, that would be true. This is called job lock. I know many people who work on healthcare systems and they study job lock. And one of the things that they try to do when they design national systems, or the arguments for national systems, is that you will reduce job lock, basically. But that's employees that are locked into work with a particular employer because they know they have a good plan, and comparing plans between employees is a little bit heterogeneous. And people have studied the rollout, for instance, of Obamacare. And if I recall correctly, there was very little impact on job lock from the rollout of Obamacare state by state in the early 2010s. I think it's also true that people have studied job lock in the European context, and it's not super obvious that the effects of these nationalized healthcare systems in Europe at the moment, as far as I know, have had large impacts on job lock. I think it's a theoretical, I mean, on that level, people can argue that the real problem was in the 1940s when the US agreed to basically tax healthcare services, or to deduct healthcare services from the wage bill. That creates an incentive for firms to start offering these heterogeneous, difficult to compare healthcare plans, and that the real solution for that's laissez-faire. If you had that, the US system would be better and more flexible. I mean, they're both theoretical arguments where the empirical evaluation, I think, for these being large effects, I don't know that that's out there. I'd be very interested in having my mind change if someone's watching this, but basically, I've looked for evidence of that. I have not been able to find it. And I found evidence against these being major effects. Certainly the one that you mentioned on job lock. So.
Okay, so I don't think the two of us are gonna resolve that job lock issue. But I mean, see, there's this one statistic I think from Our World in Data, which shows the correlation between, I guess, longevity, life expectancy, and the spending on healthcare per capita. And
it's quite low, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the issue is, I mean, even in the US, I mean, it's basically this outlier country where you're spending so much money, and then, but then the life expectancy is kind of like average, I think, within OECD.
Yes. Well, the US has cars. I mean, there are many differences. The US has a much higher murder rate than many OECD countries. I mean, many of our cities have a higher murder rate than, say, Moscow. Some statistic I found recently, very surprising. And we also have a car culture, and a car culture creates about 40,000 deaths per year. I think that number has been going up. And so it would be very interesting to see, to what extent the specific causes of death from like just cars and homicide, to what extent those are contributing to the life expectancy gap between the US and Europe. There's a third cause, which is deaths of despair, basically drugs and alcohol. We know that to some extent this is caused by cronyism. You can argue that this is a healthcare cost, but it's not, it's so not obvious to me that if we just copied Canada, that we would have dodged deaths of despair. That's why I'm very interested in people who would make an argument like that you could have dodged things like the opioid crisis and alcohol. I read Case and Deaton's book very closely, and their argument is that there's a general malaise. It's caused by the working class having a lot of problems. It's also caused by very specific physician, worker, and physician, maybe pharmacy interactions, where physicians were told that these medications, are not that addictive or have very limited side effects. Those dynamics also exist basically in state healthcare systems. So I'm very interested in clear and coherent arguments that things would be quite different. I think it just may have happened that the US has a lot of medical innovation, some of those medical innovations will be deleterious, right? Some of those medical innovations will be ineffective. They will have side effects. It will take time for people to figure out what those side effects are. So there's one author, I believe his name is Room, and he has a 2021 review of the book in which he argues that most deaths of despair, and thus a large amount of the slowdown in U.S. life expectancy gains since the 2010s, are basically just opioid addiction. I mean, and it's simple math that if you lose 100,000 people ages, let's say, 45 to 54, that actually has a large effect on your life expectancy, because many of the changes in life expectancy happen in the upper tail, basically people who add an extra year from 70 to 80. So a big change that's in the middle of the distribution would have a big impact. And people have even argued now that there's impacts on infants. And so sudden infant death syndrome, and I think related things in the US, people have noticed that they're surprisingly high. I believe that they're correlated with opioid deaths. So what it appears is that many of these mothers who are giving birth, basically the babies are not especially strong and they die soon after being born. Those are all the kinds of things that have large effects on your life expectancy that are not linked in a clear way to the kinds of health system changes that you're proposing. Now, I'm not an expert in health systems. My research is not in health systems. I just happen to know a lot of people, and I'm at a place where there's a lot of work on health systems. And many people argue, for instance, there are cases where, for instance, I believe that there was a Medicare expansion, and it's worth thinking about the fact that Sweden, for instance, after they did a nationalization, similar expansions, did not appear to have a rapid increase in life expectancy. They were on an upward trajectory before, they were on an upward trajectory afterwards. So I think some of these things are not impossible to solve, and it's not like they're not policy related, actually. Like opiates is very obviously policy related. It's very obviously health policy related, but it matters sort of how the details of like how the FDA approves drugs. How do we monitor drugs when they're in the environment? Those to me are the kinds of details that would have made major impacts, I think, from the 1990s to the present on the US life expectancy trajectories. Yet they're things that are unsexy. They're not part of the live debate. They don't fit into the narratives that we have about healthcare. And so I think that they're unlikely to be pursued. And I think there's reviews of this that just conclude, like, for instance, Lincoln Fallon, they basically have a very famous set of arguments, basically, that SES is a fundamental cause of health and health inequalities. And I think what they mean by that is that people who have less resources have less access to health advice, health information. When they get health information, they're likely to adhere. And then they might be less likely to adhere to these health protocols. And then essentially the proposal that they have at the end is they have like this long list of proposals. And Philip Cohen has said they might as well propose like just socialism in like a set of quotes. And I think that that's a very common academic way of thinking about social problems that goes back to Engels, right? Engels basically, in his book on the city, I mean, probably maybe even before, more or less concludes that what many of these cities in the UK need is better planning, better urban planning. And then that kind of gives rise to a lot of the pro-planning sentiment in academia. And I think that that basically is less obviously false. It's obviously false when you look at the entire economy. There's problems that start to emerge, but it's less obviously false when it comes to things like healthcare, where we do have like a lot of detailed information on what the problems are. And what I wonder is if it wouldn't actually be better just to solve the specific problems that we found, for instance, in the US healthcare systems. For instance, why don't we do better opioid tracking, which I think we do to some extent? Why don't we tax alcohol more? Why don't we, have more suicide prevention, mental health treatments? I don't know if there's causal evidence on the third thing. I've looked for that. I don't know if there's causal evidence on that. But anytime you find these kinds of cause of death disparities, it always raises the question of why you don't attempt to target those more. People who argue more for like kind of universal approaches and regime type approaches, they basically have arguments that, well, the targeted regimes are too complicated for people to actually navigate. And maybe that's true. But I think I see that as kind of like a live debate on healthcare policy today.
I mean, also, I think would be very troubled by looking at policy reforms as being trade-offs. That is to say, you can only have one, you cannot have the other. I think you can combine, a movement to its, a single-payer healthcare system, but then also, you could redesign urban policy, to build things closer together so you can actually take public transit and you don't have to drive a car where you could crash, or we could have more active anti-drug policies to prevent people from using it. We could crack down on fentanyl, which I saw has been a major source of death over the last 5-6 years or so. So yeah, I would not say that the policies necessarily should be seen as a trade-off. I think if we say, well, we need a holistic solution to improving the public health of our population, I think that a multi-pronged approach is perfectly acceptable. Now, there's also, so within healthcare, I mean, I know this is a right-wing argument about innovation, right? Where they're saying, well, the fact that our, pharmaceutical sector, for instance, is so very expensive, well, it's because you have to recoup the investment losses from the, pharmaceutical drugs that didn't turn a profit. And then the argument is, well, I mean, if America doesn't, pay exorbitant amounts of money on medicine, then there won't be any innovation. I mean, the Europeans and the Japanese and the Canadians, they purchase the medical innovations from America. So, I guess the argument would be then, the cost of having, substantially reduced costs of prescription drugs would be a stifling of innovation. I mean, what's your take on this argument?
I'm not an expert. I have very few published things in healthcare. It sounds plausible to me. I have seen things that are like, well, the US's medical innovations have created like $1 trillion in value each year by keeping elderly people alive for a year longer, and they'd be willing to pay for this much in health. And the US does have a lot of healthcare patents. And if you look at even during COVID-19, other countries were able to design one or two different types of vaccines. Most, the US came out with 3 different types of vaccines. So there's obviously some kinds of R&D benefit. The question for me becomes like a very technical kind of cost benefit type of question that I would need to really think about. But what you've said sounds plausible. But then you might argue, well, the drugs are expensive and maybe people can't get access to them. People argue things like that. The US, for instance, does have, I know a little bit about what's called orphan drugs. The US has a lot of these drugs where I think the market is like not especially large for them. And we have done a good job of solving diseases that very few people have. And that's often spearheaded by people who have a lot of money. So it's a basic, maybe unpleasant fact of economics, such as that people have come up with these little models where the more inequality you have in a society, the more likely some public goods are to be provided, under some cases, because then it becomes worth it.
So you have to hope that a really rich person
basically has your disease. But the other thing is that in other systems, there might be no hope of that. Right. Okay. So I have 2 systems choices, right? There's like Rawls. I have a choice in which I can be born into a society in which if I am in this disadvantaged position, I have absolutely no hope of surviving past age 5, like a Lorenzo's oil type of situation where I need the special oil just to be able to live a few more years. And there might be other systems where basically if, I guess, who would be the kind of, I'm trying to think of medical billionaires who would be interested in this kind of thing, or people who are, what's the guy who is the CEO of Oracle, for instance, someone like that. You basically need to, you need to get Ellison interested in your illness, and then you can find a cure. So I don't know that there's easy answers to things like this. I don't work on medical innovations in that way. And what you've said sounds plausible. I just don't know how big a deal it is. I do know that Japan also has a lot of medical innovations, and they have a more generous system, when it comes to medical provision. And it's also unclear, for instance, how much medical payments are linked to, like you could imagine something like this, like the state just puts up a giant prize. We want cures for this. And so then we have systems of prizes. Okay, we want cures for these 10 diseases. If you show that they work, we will give you like $200 million or $1 billion. And that way, if anyone does it, they get the $1 billion up front. It incentivizes everyone to behave cheaply. So there are a lot of things I've seen published on the efficacy of just having the state assign prizes. It's a puzzle why they don't do more of that. There are cases where I know that has been successful. I think Mazzucato has a book on the entrepreneurial state, basically, and I think she does cover prizes in there, as well as just the huge state investments in R&D that did seem to have some return to them. I just don't know that.
So you get the prize money, obviously, before you do the research.
No, after. You have to succeed.
Okay.
So this kind of presupposes that you have people in the society that have the resources to do this kind of research, and the first one to succeed, they get the prize. And I know that some of the problems in kind of implementing that system are like, number one, basically the state has strong incentives to shirk. So for instance, there was someone in the UK 200 something years ago, the UK had a prize basically to come up with a system for keeping track of longitudes when you're at sea. He figured it out, and then he spent the next 20 years fighting with the UK to get his prize money. So that's what happened. The state has very strong incentives to shirk after the public good has been created. So how do you solve a problem like that? I can imagine a type of future in which people are using things like crypto or some kind of like weird third-party contract enforcement to ensure that the money gets paid out. Like the state is locked in a vault, and it's a third party who decides, who's not the actual like treasury bursar. And then that's the person who decides whether the price satisfies. That could be an alternative innovation model for you to get Lorenzo's oil. That could be something I imagine working. And it would be, I think that there should just be more policy experiments on stuff like this in general. I mean,
well, struggling with the state is always going to be difficult because they're the ones who write the rules of the game, right? So if they're not playing ball, then yeah, nobody can coerce them, right?
Yeah. And then you waste the innovator's time in the meantime. So the guy who invented longitude, presumably, or figured out how to actually calculate it when you're at sea, presumably that guy had other things he could be doing in the 20 years between his invention and I guess finally either getting paid or dying. I forgot. Maybe he never got paid.
But what about like the invention of penicillin, right? Was it 1950s or so, where there was no patent that was filed on that drug, and
I think you might mean the polio vaccine.
Was it the polio vaccine?
Salk, famously he didn't patent it. I think penicillin's a few decades earlier, but it might have been until the 1950s when it became widely available. I know it was used during World War II, for instance, but the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk has a famous quote, "Could you patent the sun?" I think this is now regarded to be something of a myth that although he made some contributions to a workable versions of the polio vaccine, I think he had a business person look into it, and it wasn't clear that there was enough to create a patentable IP. So it may have been a nice thing to say when you want to give, I think he did want to give it away for free anyway. He was a workaholic. He really liked the idea of medical innovations for the people. He really had this kind of mindset, but it's also not clear that if he had gone the other way and tried to set up, Salk Pharmaceuticals on the basis of that patent, I don't know that he would have been awarded one. So those basically kinds of, I think that there's been some revision on basically the case of Salk.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this debate about how much of what gets produced is because of market means and intellectual property and things like that, and how much do we provide for free, and I would say for the latter one, I mean, we know it exists, right? I mean, so within families, right? I mean, if our parents didn't charge us to to be raised by them and live in their housing, so yeah, so we definitely know that we humans, I mean, we are able to provide things as a charity or as karma, I guess, if you're within the Indian tradition, to others without profiting financially, yeah, and I mean, so I don't have like a magic policy prescription for this one, but I would think I guess that's a theory of moral sentiment part of, Adam Smith, right? Where, I want to be well regarded and well liked by my peers, by others, and therefore I'm willing to, provide, yeah, you could say charity services to the broader public. And I think that element, um, should not be underestimated, and I hope there's going to be more of that. Um, yeah, I guess it would be a version of socialism, you could say, without calling it that.
I guess I've thought a little bit about that. I think a lot of the problem is the planning and the knowledge problem. I think there's still no great answer to how do you know what goods to produce and in what quantities, and that people really want them and they're not just saying that they want them. The price system kind of solves that automatically. And then and property rights are an easy way to figure out who should get paid under the price system. You can imagine a central planner like an AI that basically abolishes property rights but still has prices. The AI owns everything and it just pays you to do stuff. And then everyone does what they're supposed to do. The AI's figured out that this maximizes welfare. So I think if you read like Jacobin and things like that, I don't think that they say really that they have an answer to Hayek's critique of the older forms of socialism, but I think that they're very skeptical of property rights. And maybe that is a more productive way for them to go in the 21st century. That would be my only comment. I think that ultimately,
but who owns the AI, right? I mean,
well, right. Yeah. I mean, this is an issue. The AI may own itself. And also there's this iron cage. I think there's another criticism, which is this iron cage of rationality thing, which is that you don't want to have an AI over your shoulder telling you what to do all the time, even if it's the right thing to do. I think people just don't like that. It is a form of slavery, right? I mean, even though it's telling you marry her, she's the best for you, buy that house, it's the best for you. You should have 2 kids, maybe 3. We'll decide depending on how your career goes. Here's what you do at work. If an AI was telling you to do this every 5 minutes, it's not obvious that people find this pleasant or pleasurable. That same kind of problem exists in market systems, right? Eventually, we may have this problem that emerges organically in market systems where, every minute of your day, there's somewhere between your boss, the iPhone, things that you've constrained yourself with, they're telling you what to do. This is approximately rational. And yet you feel at the time that it's not freely chosen. This is another problem that I think is not easily solved, and it may just create a worse kind of situation that people psychologically feel, even if the system worked very well at creating great material benefits. I mean, when people read about, for instance, Amazon warehouse workers, I think there's something about the regimentation and the working people to exhaustion that really rubs people the wrong way, even though Amazon workers probably make more money than their other like opportunities.
And even though it only takes 2 days to get the package as a customer.
Yeah, and even though it only takes, well, I don't know. From the consumer side, it's not so obvious that those costs are visible. But there are many people, I think scholars, intellectuals, activists, people who have that sense that they don't want to be bound into this kind of iron cage. I mean, you can imagine a world in which Amazon gets bigger and bigger and accumulates all of the property and items in the country, and then just tells you what to do. And it's a market system. In theory, Amazon could fail. And in theory, you can buy property, but it's never efficient for you to buy property from Amazon because Amazon always knows how to use the property better than you do. And you would ask yourself, is this a good system? Do you have like freedom? Do you have
it's like playing the casino against the bank, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or yeah, it's like playing against the casino. The AI always wins, and there's no role for humans or humanity in that kind of future. I think we're far from that. I think that this is a fake problem. I think that this is truly an academic and scholarly exercise at this point. But 2100, 2150, it's not so obvious. I mean, Amazon's still growing very quickly, and this kind of AI invading more and more of our lives in fairly productive ways right now, in ways that feel good, that basically you're kind of constructing the cage in a way. And the more information you give the AI, the better the recommendations it gives, until finally it.
Well, because the cage is golden, right? It feels good while you're inside of it, right?
Yeah. So I think that this is a problem that would occur in almost any system. Now Weber originally had this, he was setting it out to criticize planned systems. But I think the problems with planning are things like prices and not getting the accounting right, and that things start to become very inefficient. And I think that if you look at people who are actually like theorists of socialism today, I think that they've kind of taken the L, so to speak, on the prices thing. And what they're trying to get around is these constraints that are imposed by property relations. That's my one line interpretation of where scholarly activity is happening, and what the conundrums are. Like, if you want to think about these big systems in the 21st century, now as an academic who has to publish papers, I don't spend very much time thinking about the issue beyond, Twitter, blog comments, stuff like that. But those things, talking to you, come to mind almost immediately as problems that will occur in like the system level evolution that I think you're very interested in, like in the 21st century.
Well, I would say so. Weber, he was definitely very critical of socialist planning regime, but I think his criticism was much broader. I think it's about the rationalist order, which includes capitalism, and to the extent that the rationalization regime, that's to say making everything countable and then maximizing the number, whatever that number is. He was really critical of that, and there's really nothing within the past I don't know, years of, I guess, historical development that would make me doubt Weber's iron cage thesis. I mean, it's just like listening to what you just said with the Amazon warehouse work experience, and then basically caging us all in, not just workers there, but also as consumers, tying our hands. It seems like the iron cage is a general trend, a general movement of broader society, and um, and Weber really liked, just like Marx. I think they're driven by the same normative value system, which is like valuing freedom, like individual freedom, right? And I mean, because if you didn't value it, then why would you critique the iron cage, right? So and then I think freedom can eventually be found even within the caged rationalist order that we live in, but it would have to be done consciously and surreptitiously. I don't know, did you read the Eric Olin Wright thesis on like realistic utopias?
If it's the one that includes Wikipedia as one of them, then I have read a short piece on that. Yes,
that's right. So Wikipedia was
yeah,
one of his main examples, but then I think UBI was the other one. So it was
yeah,
always about
sure.
like basically, so because Olin Wright, I mean, he was like old school Marxist socialist, right? So he really thought about, I mean, in the early years it was like it's analytical Marxist scheme, and how do we understand the class system, and then the sort of normative commitment was always like, how do we destroy the capitalist order? And I think like towards the end of his life, I mean, I don't think he went away from that socialist ideal, but rather he said the way to get there, it's not going to be whatever workers' revolution, take over state power and smash the private property regime. I think it's more modest. It's like, hey, let's build the Wikipedia. Hey, let's like introduce the UBI policy. And maybe start to make it local, and then because then you can account for cost of living differences in different regions. And then gradually this is a way to I don't know, create pockets of freedom for people, and that's why, I mean, I've been very supportive of basic income. I think that's one of the reasons for that, because because at least it provides a sort of narrative like within this rationalist iron cage, like will find pockets of freedom, right? Even if it's not complete, you know. Yeah, I mean, but do you have a take on this?
I mean, what you're saying, the UBI thing is again a way of getting to what the socialists are trying to achieve while respecting the knowledge problem constraints, right? Which is that ultimately no single entity is capable of doing all the planning that's required for the allocation of goods and services. So what do? Well, you outsource that to individual consumers, and then you just give them all money. And then that solves the problem, because now many of the things you might be concerned with, basically they kind of go away. At the same time, prices are set at the levels that they need to be set at to equilibrate the economy. But this kind of brings us back to the earlier problem. If you have, for instance, terrible housing policy in UBI, basically the effect of UBI would be to increase housing prices and to make, because you have a fixed number of housing, everyone has to live somewhere. And so I do prefer this more targeted approach, because I think many of the times policymakers have very limited attention. And they also have to choose an order in which to solve problems. And
you're
so
saying you have to fix the housing market, for instance.
well, we can imagine this kind of world in which, basically, let's say that we have very, very simple model. We have 5 people and there's 3 houses, okay? And then we give everyone a UBI. And what's going to happen? And 3 of the people own the houses. Well, the other 2 people are going to just be giving all their UBI to the 3 people who own the houses. Now, let's make it so that we have 2 houses, that we can build up to 5 houses. Well, suddenly now UBI is much more efficacious. But even if you didn't have UBI, you'd still want to build the houses. So that's why I prefer this kind of targeted approach, because it solves social problems that actually affect people. There's usually some kind of metric. If you change one thing at a time, you could imagine being able to evaluate this kind of thing. I think these are many of the assumptions and the certain viewpoint that many people who are part of the program evaluation movement have. I'm very sympathetic to that movement. I'm very sympathetic to attempts to rationally evaluate government programs. And I think that one of the things that you lose in the Big Bang approach is that if you're changing too many things at once, you can't do that. I think another thing you lose is that you might want to just solve these problems like one at a time, just for policymaker attention, because program details might matter. And policymakers are not able to spend, more than 8 hours in a day, usually, keeping track of metrics and making sure things are going right. There's certainly constraints on the government and state capacity. State capacity is not unlimited. I mean, I worked a little bit in a small policy making role at the Commerce Department, and that's something you learn very quickly is like, look, here's the list of 5 things we can do today. And we cannot do 7 things. Okay, so what are the 5 things we're going to do? That doesn't mean that there's not opportunities to expand or contract, but policymaker attention is fixed. There is a trade-off when you start to think about it that way. And that would be something that I think people who are interested in any scheme of reform, that they actually try to consider, and to consider cases in which policy reform has led to errors simply because policymakers don't have enough attention. Like I think of the Great Society, some of the programming in that, where they were trying to do many different things at once, they weren't able to see which ones succeeded or failed. It's often difficult to reverse some of these things when they're put into place. These are the reasons I'm a little bit more, I wouldn't say conservative, but I would say linear in how I approach some of these policy problems.
But okay, for UBI, I think the state capacity.
No, that's the benefit. The benefit is that the state capacity to implement doesn't need to be large. Be very limited.
So we already have experience with the Social Security program for the last 9 years.
Right. Yeah. I don't have those kinds of strong objections to UBI on that basis for sure. It's actually an advantage compared to others. Compared to existing social welfare provision, is that existing social welfare provision is very complicated, and then there's often many hoops and a lot of paperwork and things like that, and it reduces a lot of that kind of thing. And
if I put on the libertarian hat, when you say, "Wow, okay, I'm the housing policy expert," so my view is that housing shortages are the biggest, social policy problem, and then you ask somebody who is an education policy expert, and they say, no, you got to fix the colleges, and so
they'll just lie. Yeah, experts will just start lying about what the largest policy problem is.
Right,
That's
and then
probably true.
and that's why I think the sort of the libertarian UBI supporter might say, well, maybe the simplest solution, that is the one where you need to hire the fewest policy experts to study the problem and evaluate, etc., um, might be the most attractive policy.
Yeah, I'm very interested in how the UBI experiments go. In the US in the last 7 years, there have been a lot of UBI experiments. I think the general line is that they cause people to accumulate more education, but then that makes it hard for them to evaluate because, okay, we did a UBI, a ton of people spent of the 5 years we evaluated, they spent 3 years finishing their high school degree, and then they did have higher incomes in years 4 and 5, but we need to look at the long-term trajectories. I mean, I think of this as almost kind of something where you just need larger experiments than what we've done, and also, frankly, over a much longer time horizon. Because another problem, people who oppose UBI will argue, for instance, I think of Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago. He would say something like, UBI basically will cause the work efforts to deteriorate, and so all the program evaluations of UBI are wrong. They're upwardly biased because you're measuring the effects of income at the time when work ethic has not yet deteriorated. If you allowed it to run for a generation, the work ethic would deteriorate, and that's the true effect of UBI. That's what he would argue. And I think, that could be possible. It's possible for sure. So why don't we do simply a large trial at scale and then see what happens? And I think that's something, that kind of experimental line of thinking I'm very open to. I think that that's really the way to go. And it could very well be that actually we find very small effects. So I think a little bit of the welfare debates from the 1970s and 1980s, where, at the end of the day, when we tried to evaluate these things, we found that welfare probably did have an effect, but in quantitative terms, it was just small, at least for men, compared to other things that were going on in the society, like deindustrialization and so on. And so, you have to ask the question, if UBI reduces the amount of hours worked from, 45 on average by people with a high school degree to 38, is that a cost that society can bear? And maybe the answer is yes. On the other hand, if the true reduction in work hours is something like 45 to 10, and you have constant labor shortages like we have right now, or like many people think we have right now, this could be a large social problem. So my own take is simply that this is an empirical question, and there are evaluations going on right now, which I'm very excited about. I think that this could be a great opportunity to do much better. But if I find that the data is telling me that UBI has been expensive and has not generated large gains, for instance, one study found that it led to a lot of divorces. I think that was one of the originals. Then it becomes a question of why should I personally be commit to this versus the status quo alternative? That would be what I would put to you is, why not wait for experimental results? Why not treat this as something where we can learn something about the society and actually do the investigation? That would be the counter argument.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of an overall review of all of the UBI studies that have ever been done, I think I would be over challenged to give you the summary of that now. But I remember there was this one trial they did in Finland, and where the government party they selected, I believe it was I want to say 2,000 individuals, but they were all the current recipients of unemployment benefit, right? The KELA system, which is the name of the welfare agency. And their finding was that it did not increase employment take up, which was the main outcome that the government Finland intended to measure. Which to me, it's a very problematic approach to figure out you could say general equilibrium effects. That is to say, if you in order to determine that, I think you would have to enroll the entire population, or a random sample of the entire population, as opposed to targeting it to the long-term unemployed, who might be I don't know, exhibiting certain features that make them I don't know, unlikely to participate in the labor market because I don't know, they were out of the labor force for too long, or they were, raising a family in the meanwhile, or whatever, or sickness or something like that. So, so I think, I mean, to really take the Finland case study and then argue that, well, it's not going to increase employment. I think that's, I guess my complaint would be that, it's not the right sample selection, you could say, right?
Yeah, I'm very open to any of these kinds of arguments. I think that, look, more studies are necessary. This is a common way to end articles, and there's something to that. And I think that there is a sample selection issue, but I also think there's an issue of doing these things at scale. I think as well, like, look, if you do it in a small town of 1,000 people who know each other and who can kind of monitor each other and say, hey, stop being lazy, or you knocked up my sister and now I'm very angry about that. That kind of monitoring and close evaluation that happens in small communities, I don't know that would happen in New York. There's other reasons to believe, if you implement UBI in a small town or in a smaller scale country, it's just not obvious that some of these things would scale up in the same way, and they might scale up and be much worse. So I think a little bit about Perry Preschool. Do you know the Perry Preschool experiment?
No.
Well, it's a very interesting experiment from the 1960s in which they gave children who had very low test scores from disadvantaged backgrounds, like a lot of extra teaching and time interacting, basically, I believe, with graduate students. And the early evaluation said that it failed because it didn't boost test scores. But then when the kids grew up, it was noticed that the kids were more likely to get married, they didn't smoke as much, they were less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. That turns out to be like the biggest single thing, is just not going to jail. And to what do we attribute these changes? And that has led to the development of ideas like grit, stuff on like dynamic, basically complementarity and skills you learn in the life course, kind of alternatives just to a simple approach where you just use test scores as an evaluation of whether or not this program works. So I'm very, very open to this idea that, okay, you could be looking at the wrong outcome, but even if you look at the right outcomes and you try to scale a program, that's not a guarantee that it's going to work. If you look at the scalings of Perry Preschool, like Head Start and things like that, Head Start has had much smaller benefits, frankly, than the Perry Preschool did. That doesn't mean that it fails the cost-benefit test. I have nothing. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Probably it doesn't, but it does mean that there are things that happen when you scale a program that don't happen when you're working at a small scale. So people call this implementation science. There's a lot of attention to this now in the social sciences. I think it's a great thing. It's long necessary to have people paying attention to what happens when you go from a community of 1,000 people to 10,000 people to a whole state. I think that this is actually a welcome development compared to the other maybe negative things that we were talking about earlier. And I think that the same challenges are faced with UBI. I think ultimately, I guess the lesson of philosophy that I take is that philosophy is often not a great way to learn about the social world. I think that ultimately there does need to be some empirical basis for these things from which to reason. I think people who are, believers in the Marxist dream, I guess what I would say to them is that Engels and Marx, certainly at the start of their careers, were very interested in data collection, and they were very interested in the actual fate of the working class as measured. And I think that if they had lived long enough, they would have changed their mind about some things, or they would have said, well, we have very little. They would have been much more cautious in their short and medium term projections. Like, for instance, Marx was very excited about the 1848 revolution. And then he thought that, I think that in the 1860s, there would be a revolution. Then by the time you get to 1870s, he says something like, oh, we had very high expectations for those times. He eventually became more cautious about what he thought was possible in that time period. But I think that ultimately these things need to have an empirical basis. I think
Well, I would say that
okay,
Marx was a very poor predictor of revolutions and social change in that way. I think he was a much better historian and theorist of capitalism, and I think that's probably the thing that we in the modern social sciences revere him for. It's more like the past things.
I guess what I'm responding to is that you have this notion of freedom, right? This notion of freedom, and then UBI satisfies that. And I think that this kind of way of reasoning where we have this category, and then once we have implemented a certain policy, then we've moved into this new regime, and in that new regime, things will be very different. That is what I think the experimentalist and the empirical approach, I think that that's kind of challenged. I think these are two different ways of seeing the world. They sometimes agree, they don't always agree. That is more what I'm responding to rather than the very specific details, but Marx himself, because there's many other grand theorists who have ideas about the way the world is going to change. I think a little bit of Durkheim, I think a little bit of Daniel Bell, people like that, the coming of the post-industrial society. Those are cases where I think ultimately it is very difficult to do social forecasting. And I think that the easiest way to do it is to try to be as empirical as possible and to try to reason from data and experiments and cases where we can look at what actually happened. I think like that's the best way to predict, what will happen in the next 0 to 5 years is much more something like that. And even 5 to 100 years, I think you're better off doing something like that than you are in general in thinking in these broader philosophical terms. That said, I am a big fan of social theory. I think there needs to be probably more social theory rather than less. I feel like grand theorizing that could be informed by like what we've learned in the last 20 years could be something very beautiful. And I simply have not seen that much of it, I would say.
Right. So on this point about UBI and measuring the right outcome, I mean, I think I want to go back to this point of like employment, and it's so I also study mostly automation, the future of work. That's been my main interest. And I sort of always come back to this like normative question about is the right approach, so really a normative question more than an empiricist one. I mean, that we should be maximizing the level of employment in society, because I mean, it seems to me that yes, policymakers and of course the policy advisors, policy experts like ourselves maybe, are sort of kind of saying yes to that because that seems to be the easiest template that we can draw on in order to deal with social problems, right? Always about thinking about maximizing the amount of jobs. So that's what on the left wing, it's sort of the full employment public sector job guarantee proposals are sort of focused on that. And then sort of the right wing policy approach is I don't know, tax breaks to companies who invest more in jobs and employment creation.
But they're both full employment approaches.
Yeah, these are both full employment approaches, and I am a little bit troubled by that. So I'm also influenced by André Gortz, who's one of these, I guess, French, Austrian social theorists, in his writings, I mean, he talks about like deindustrialization and automation.
And finding new objects, basically, or subjects for, I think, the left. And I think the point is that they want to move away from the proletariat. Is that him?
Yeah, move away from the proletariat. I mean, goodbye, farewell to the working class. And so I'm actually very I'm biased to some extent because I am very sympathetic to that viewpoint. Like if you remember in Marx and the German ideology, he writes about like the freedom to to hunt and fish and criticize, but without having to be those occupations, right? So you don't have to be a hunter, a professional hunter, a professional fisherman, a professional critic. You should just be able to self-determine and self-organize your time and your life. And it seems to me that, going back to Gort's point, I think that technologically, I think we have already achieved the capacity to, I don't know, to allow for like a self-determined life. But our ideology still says no, we need full employment. And then this is the systems that we created. I mean, the state that needs to raise tax revenues, which means you need investment from the private sector, right? Which means that they need profits, they need more markets, they need to grow, they need more consumers, they need more laborers. So we sort of, again, it goes back to the iron cage. I mean, we were sort of trapped in this hamster in the wheel cycle. And I think that, even, when we, as a social researchers, like, let's say if we studied empirically the effects of UBI on employment uptake, right? We're sort of contributing to that.
Yeah, you're invested in the
normative.
system. This is a good argument. I guess the thing to say is that there's a lot of individual psychological studies on unemployment, especially in men, that finds basically that this is one of the, I think it's in the same order of magnitude, like long-term unemployment of like your spouse dies or something. That many people who are long-term unemployed are severely unhappy. There are measures, for instance, of extreme distress, and the extreme distress meter in the US has gone up, maybe it's doubled, something like this. I don't have the statistic offhand. And basically, what are the predictors of being someone in extreme distress? Well, their parent worked in industrial occupation. They are in an education location that was once heavily industrialized, and now there's no work to do for them. I think people do have innate desires to be useful to the society. It's a way of constructing an identity. I think it's a not unhelpful way of constructing an identity. I think alternate ways of people constructing identities might be just worse. You don't know. They could just lead you down paths that are less productive. I think many people are not so interested in like long scholarly disquisitions or producing a lot of these works of art that I think many academics imagine they would do if freed up with UBI. I think that if we looked at these Finnish guys, I don't think there will be any great artworks produced. I'm open to it. Some of them I'm sure would go back to school and pursue an education, which I think that should almost certainly be included. But I think people need to face this kind of challenge that many people, when faced with the prospect of what scholars would consider leisure, in some ways, even if supported by the state, they consider that to be internally a miserable experience. So how do we deal with that? Well, and another thing is that you could even say something like, well, that's because they've only been conditioned this way from ages 10 to 20. Okay, but then we still have 40 years of cohorts that have that kind of conditioning until you can create the new people who are conditioned in the right way. I think it just there's severe practical problems that come to mind.
Yeah, okay, so let me clarify a certain term here. So when I say I'm against work, I mean I'm actually against wage work. So but what about community work or family work, which could be like a household or oriented activities, or creative work. I mean, that's the things that you mentioned. I mean, like the podcasting, where there's no financial gain whatsoever. I mean,
and no possibility of financial gain, I would say. So, I mean, the question is how many people will go for it. It's an open question. I mean, right. So there's studies in the US right now on screen time. And a lot of young men who are NEETs, essentially, do you know NEET? It's not an education, unemployment, and training. What they do is they essentially watch YouTube and the boomers before them who were unemployed, they watch television all day. So we have empirical evidence of what happens when people, I'm sure they have access to community work. They could volunteer. In fact, some of them could do family work, right? It'd be very interesting to try to say, which fraction of this population has access to a family member that could use attention and care. I have my parents are old now. I have to I call them every day. I consider that like duty, but it's also something that I think will keep them alive longer and do it because I love them and all this kind of things. So, but not everyone does that. A lot of people don't do that. And so I think it's very interesting. And I think a lot of unemployed people who are without work don't do that. I think ultimately, we should not be making these assumptions about human nature. We should be trying to look into the world and see what are the cases that are closest to the target case that we're investigating and look at what people actually do. I mean, that's my inclination is more towards this kind of empiricism and this way of looking at it. And there are people who manage to get on disability in the US. Disability in the US is not generous. It's something like $10,000 to $20,000 a year. So you will not die, but it becomes very difficult for you to live in some ways. And we look at these people and they're not usually happy. even though they're playing video games and engaged in activities I would consider to be epic pleasure, basically, playing World of Warcraft or Grand Theft Auto or things like that. They don't usually score like, as in, I don't know if they're very unhappy, if this is the same category of people who are in extreme distress, but I know that people who are on disability are on average below happiness, or below average happiness. So I think that this raises kinds of questions about the individual psychological effects. Now, you could argue that there's going to be social psychological effects when we move away from this world in which people construct their identities through paid wage work. I have less to say about that. I don't know that what you're saying is impossible. I think it might be possible. It might be possible to have this kind of society in which people freely contribute and output is high enough to redistribute that through UBI and things kind of work out. I don't know about that. But I would just say that within
Well, we would be
getting
closer
to
today than
there,
we were 20 years ago, right?
yeah,
It should be
getting
easy
to
over
there,
time.
it could get easier over time. I guess that's true. I guess that's is an interesting point. It's more of, to me, food for thought. That should be something I'm going to meditate on, rather than something that I think is a live possibility. Right? I don't know that this is a live possibility in the U.S. or Europe or Asia.
Okay, so let's go to one of your papers. You write about job tenure inequality, which varies by industry and not by time. Yeah, like just describe to our listeners.
Okay, so
What you
many
argue
times
there.
you'll hear things like concerns over the gig economy or worries that jobs for life are going away. And what I do in this paper is I basically take textbook but advanced, I would say, demographic methods. I put them on a computer because no one had bothered before to write up, R code to actually use these methods. They were just sitting around in papers and in Excel sheets. And I, at scale, basically apply this for all the cross sections of data that we have available in the US. And what I find is basically that the average job tenure has been like 2 years, between 2 and 3 years for like the last 20 years. It's extremely stable. Most people, they seem to, over the life course, spend about 2.5 years on the job. This happens to align well with panel estimates. And so it's kind of cool because it shows that you can use demographic data from repeated cross sections without needing to build these giant panel data sets and track everyone through time, which I think is the ongoing trend in social science. And my general goal with this paper is to try to draw attention to demographic methods and to show that, no, you can compute interesting quantities, and you can also look at kinds of interesting heterogeneities, that these methods are not just for the human life course, they can be used for all kinds of social processes. That's the point of this paper. On the other hand, the thing to say about heterogeneity by industry is basically that some industries are very different from other ones. If you work in leisure and hospitality, I believe that you're expected to have usually less than a year of job tenure. On the other hand, if you work in the health or education sector, it's usually like every job stint is like 4 years. And so I think we learned something about the sort of different industrial experiences that workers actually have that are not visible at the population level. And if you just think about what I said, I think it makes sense. If you just think about stereotypes, someone who's working at a hotel or in a service role, maybe they're not going to be there forever. And it turns out they're going to be there far below average in the US. So I think that's kind of the point of the papers, to first of all show these kinds of new methods and then do some interesting computations with them. And I have similar works in progress that are not ready to share with anyone on racial inequalities and job tenure. I think that could be very, explosive. So I want to make sure every I is dotted and T is crossed on that. And I have similar things looking at maybe the Great Resignation. So firms right now are complaining that they can't get access to workers. Are these complaints legitimate? Is it really the case that?
But you're saying that even recessions, I mean, do they have an impact on the job tenure?
They do, but it's small. And I think I show that the job tenure falls in the middle of the Great Recession. If you control F in this paper, it's something like, I don't want to say offhand. I think it's around half a year that it falls by, which is large. And if you look at the job survival curve, it falls by a lot. And what's interesting about this is that many economists there are papers out there that have previously argued, based on data until the Great Recession, that the entire impact of the recession was on hiring rates. that actually very few people got fired from their jobs more, that this was just something from movies, that actually the firing pretty much takes place at the same rate over time, layoffs are pretty much at the same rate over time, and what a recession is really about is basically that hiring dips. And so when hiring dips, people who do get fired are going to take a longer time to find a job. Incoming cohorts are no longer able to navigate the job market. That was an argument in economics. And I think that my paper kind of shows that I don't know if people still believe this. I talk to economists regularly. I have co-authors who are economists, but it's certainly not true in the Great Recession. And I don't know if in the recession that we're entering right now, if that will be true. But certainly the case in the Great Recession, you can see that there is an increase in separations, which implies necessarily an increase in firings and things like that. And you see it immediately just by comparing the two job tenures. So I think that the old belief that recessions were all about hiring, which this did appear to be well supported by data. It just doesn't turn out to be true when you look at it from a different perspective with the more recent data. So that's what I would say about this.
Right. I mean, so there was this argument, I think, among economists about jobless recoveries, and I guess this is about the I guess experience of the U.S. labor market. I want to say post 1990 or something, right? Where we had maybe, I don't know, two or three major downturns, right? And then it just takes more and more time in order to reach the same employment level as before the recession started. And so is it correct to say that this idea of jobless recoveries, I mean, is it connected with the deindustrialization and technological change? I mean, or is it something about, I don't know, organizational restructuring within companies?
Yeah, sociologists usually like something like the latter, and then economists like something like the former. That's a very common divide. One thing to say about jobless recoveries is that it's not clear that recessions are as deep. I mean, so recessions and the business cycle, people used to claim that we had conquered the business cycle. Very interesting set of beliefs around the early 2000s. There's a famous speech by Robert Lucas claiming this. And some of what they had in mind was this concept of the Great Moderation. So what is the Great Moderation? Great Moderation is kind of a reduction in the impact of business cycles. And they argue that a large part of the Great Moderation came about basically because more and more of the US was becoming a service economy. And in the service economy, essentially, it's not, the demand for services seems to be much less flexible than the demand for goods. And so there might be smoother business cycles as we transition away from manufacturing to services. That's an argument that you find in the literature. And that might have some of the implications for this kind of jobless recovery concept, that maybe it's really easy to hire people to work in manufacturing as the economy's on the recovery, but maybe it's a little bit harder to hire people in services. So this does kind of relate to some of that earlier theory that's going on. I don't have, unfortunately, data from the 1970s and 1990s on job openings and hires is not especially good. And the hires time series from this period are not especially great. You can find a Stack Overflow somewhere with my name on it asking, how do economists calculate job hires? And I basically found all the answers pretty unsatisfactory. I think the best way to do it is really with the administrative data sets. Those administrative data sets only exist in the 21st century. Now, it happens that some of the demographic methods that I'm using have fallen into relative obscurity over this time period, which is maybe why no one has done this before. So that meant that by the time I got to doing this, there was 20 years of data that basically was like laying around waiting for someone to analyze it because no one had used these methods on it before. So I did. And then that's basically the paper on estimation of many important quantities in labor demography using some of these maybe advanced textbook methods borrowed from non-stable population theory.
Right. Okay. So you have another paper where you talk about the job mobility in declining occupations.
Oh yeah.
And then those workers are less likely to change occupations, and if they do change, it's to other declining occupations,
Yeah, people
especially.
get locked in. Yeah, people get, I have to go to the bathroom. Can you cut the last minute off of this?
Yes, we can
All right, let me go to the
do a
bathroom.
pause.
All right, so
Okay, so second half, yeah. So we were talking about job mobility in declining occupations. I mean, like, talk a
yeah,
little bit about the intuition and then the general finding there.
yeah. First, I'll talk about the intuition. The basic idea is that people who are in contracting occupations are forced to make a move. Some people in those occupations have to be forced to be mobile. So you might initially expect that they would simply be more mobile than people who are in growing occupations. And at the same time, people basically from growing occupations, they're more likely, people argue, to have opportunities within their occupation. And what we find is basically that people who are forced to be mobile, certainly inside their declining occupations, when they do have mobility, it's usually downward. They're moving to other shrinking occupations, which is a little bit surprising, right? As a mathematical fact, if it were just totally random, people from declining would be more likely to move to growing because that's becoming a bigger piece of the pie, as time goes on. And so that just turns out not to be true. It just, people get locked in
So do you
to.
have maybe like one or two ethnographic examples? I mean, just to
Sure,
give an
yeah.
idea of.
So there's research, again, deindustrialization of America. This is old, and this is not in our data set, but they study, for instance, people who formerly worked in industry, and after their plants closed down, they were likely to be unemployed or doing, driving a bus or something like that, things that were somehow on the lower end of the service economies. That's, I think, from Bluestone. And is it Bluestone? Is it Bluestone and Bennett, Bluestone and Harrison? I think that's Bluestone and Harrison. They do all these, like, they do surveys and try to look at what's happening. Yeah, Bluestone and Harrison. And then there's many studies, there's many ethnographic studies of what happens when firms are shutting down. And what the contribution of this is that this looks at like the occupation level. So what might be an example of a shrinking occupation? Well, some occupations, for instance, like computer programming, is an occupation right now that's shrinking. And people don't understand that. They think computers are very big. Well, what makes computer programmers are basically, in the US government's categorization, different from software engineers. And a lot of computer programming involves kind of routine tasks, often doesn't require a college degree, and a lot of that work has simply been outsourced or outright automated. I think you might be the expert on this, who work on automation. And we can look at what jobs computer programmers do afterwards. And a lot of the cases that we find, they're more or less working as things like driver, working as things like nurse. That's actually an optimistic example. But oftentimes they're moving in occupations that themselves might be shrinking. So that's kind of the main conclusion of this paper. I think it's actually a good idea to look at present some concrete, like in the data examples of like transitions, like from one occupation to another, where they're both declining rather than just the aggregate statistics. That's an interesting idea to have a table of some examples. Yes, so that's more or less what we find. On the other hand, people from growing or stable occupations, they tend to stay in growing or stable occupations, which is, I guess, a little bit the expected result. But what it just suggests to me is that there's this kind of correlation between the occupation that you enter and the occupation that you have access to over the life course. There's that structuring to the occupations that you will have open to you after being laid off. And it seems to advantage people who make good decisions, maybe early in their career, you could argue, such that they would get into an occupation that was eventually growing. That would be one interpretation of the findings.
Right. Yeah. It's about perhaps networks, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's related to like occupational networks.
Yeah, it's like knowing the right people. I mean, it seems to me that, like, if you live in an area where there's not very many occupations, so I guess we go back to your biography, like the GM plant in Linden, right? Then all of the most of the people that in your neighborhood, they're working in the same industry, which is also declining, right? So
they also won't have these kinds of opportunities. So that was a suggestion that we're working on in the revision, is how do we incorporate like spatial patterns or regional patterns. And in this paper, I think we're going to probably focus on very broad regions like north, south, east, west. as a statistical control. And then there might be a future paper that looks like very narrowly at, is this essentially a hidden neighborhood effect where people are kind of spatially patterned in where they work, and maybe when occupations in certain areas are declining, that means that certain areas are declining. And then that means that the people in those areas can't find other opportunities. I mean, that would be a mechanism that could explain the results that we find. But ultimately what this is like an update, and it goes into more and with much larger data sets than I think people have used before. I mean, a lot of my work is like that, where people have said this, their sample size was like 1,500. We're not so sure about methodology. Why don't we see and look if that's true? That's kind of a lot of what my research agenda actually is, especially for historical demographic cases.
Right, and also like your demographic analysis shows like middle-aged men without college degree, or sort of that group of people in declining occupations. And I mean, it seems to be very much intersecting with the death of despair argument by Case and Deaton, right? Like it's particularly this demographic that is most likely to suffer from deaths of despair, like whatever, suicide, drug addiction, etc. And actually, so your finding for that paper seems to be fitting well with that general thesis, right?
There's something wrong in people's midlives when it comes to making transitions. I think this is kind of an emerging result in multiple fields. There's economists, psychologists, sociologists who are all finding that globally the midlife crisis seems to be real, and to have an occupational shock at that time is very bad, and then to be not educated and to have an occupational shock is super bad as well. So what can I really say about this that's kind of informed? I guess Case and Deaton's economic argument is a little bit subtle, because it's not the case that high unemployment areas are high areas with lots of deaths of despair. And people who try to make an economistic argument out of it will often argue things like, well, what we think is happening is something about aspirations. And the argument goes something like this. Look, in the 1980s, there were the Lindens of the world, where even though America as a whole was deindustrializing, you could still have a high school degree and kind of make it. And you could make it and do well, actually, with hard work and what people talked about. And it seems like for many Americans, those opportunities, certainly for the less educated, are disappearing. In the last 5 or 6 years, there have been some reversals on that. So in 2017 and 19, those were the first times that like high school wages had gone up a little bit faster than college wages, very surprising patterns. People have argued about what's going on there. Maybe it's immigration, maybe it's just good luck, maybe it's technological shocks, who knows? And then in COVID, there's also been records showing that the college premium has declined. And so that would lead me to believe that maybe there are some processes happening that will reduce these kinds of inequalities. But I don't know that that's that relevant for Case and Deaton's findings, because their story is really one that's much more about aspirations. And so it could be the case that really, as long as people are falling short of their aspirations and what they wanted from their life, maybe then there will still be all of these kinds of social problems that are encountered. That could be one.
So aspirations fall short, even though their incomes might be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the papers that I co-authored with Song, it's I think Song, me, and then another professor named Thomas Coleman. We find that basically incomes across the entire distribution are going up. So you could pick a time, 1975, 1980. If it's better to be a median worker now than at the median worker then. That's maybe less true when you look at men. There might be other ways of slicing and dicing the covariates, but at the broad population level, median incomes are higher once you've adjusted for taxes and transfers. Yet, social problems in many ways have gotten worse from this time period. And so that immediately tells you, there's not a fixed relationship between these two. They have to be linked.
Right. So if you look, for instance, at the gender dynamic, right? So
right.
So in Case and Deaton's research, the emphasis is on men. I mean, is it about the shock to notions of masculinity, where masculinity is basically tied to labor market success, more or less? I mean, like having a stable job, bringing the bacon home to the family, and but then I don't know. I mean, like, what does the data say also about women and fentanyl deaths. I mean, it's also increasing, right, at a lower rate, but
Yeah.
still.
And the other problem with the simple masculinity story is that you have similar educational divides that exist in other countries and have been growing. And even cases in which women surpass men in educational achievement as like a global. I mean, that's true in the US. It's been true since the 1980s, but that's not, there's many other countries where women in certain groups surpass men. And
In terms of education, but not in terms of
and
employment, right?
sometimes in incomes, it just depends on the cohort category, things like that. And that doesn't always lead to deaths of despair. In fact, Case and Deaton argue that the US is unique and not comparable to these other countries. They use these other countries as a control in some of their analyses. And these are oftentimes controls in which deindustrializations occurred. And presumably, and in fact, shocks to the less educated wage distribution. Maybe you can argue not as extreme as the US. Maybe you want to argue about taxes and transfers. But the raw fact of deindustrialization by itself, I think that it doesn't have strong implications for rising midlife mortality. I think that that's the point that I would.
Right, because men are more likely to work in factory jobs or industrial jobs. So to the extent that deindustrialization happens, it would be a bigger shock on the male part of the labor force than the female. Yeah,
I think that's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but then also, I mean, there's this idea, okay, we bring more women to the labor force, etc. But then, isn't it the case that female labor force participation maxed out in the beginning of the 2000s? So it's about, I think, 60% or something like that.
Yeah, there's another study I can recall, but I have not been able to find on the dual earners. There was a time when both men and women both worked at the same time. And I read a report, I can swear I've read it, maybe it's in the gray literature. I can't find it on Google Scholar or anywhere, that basically says that number of dual earning households where they both earn like at similar levels and there's no motherhood penalty, that maxed out in the 1990s. And since that time, it looks like more and more households have a dominant partner for income, non-dominant partner, where one earns just way more than the other, and then the other one does childcare. That is something that I swear I've seen it, but I can't find it, so I'm not going to keep talking about it. I think Phil Cohen had tweeted about this or brought this up, and I emailed him and he didn't respond. So basically, that's kind of, I think there's a result like that out there, but I have not been able to.
So what's the ratio between male breadwinner versus female breadwinner?
Well, I think among households, it's still the male is like typically the breadwinner among like actual functioning households. But I think now there's not as much household formation as there was in the past. If you look at marriage since 2016 in the US, it's kind of fallen off a cliff. The other thing to say about this is that there's a lot of more people have argued that there's a lot more assortative mating now. So it'll be, the male is a breadwinner with like 200,000 and then the female is a breadwinner with 75,000. These could both be breadwinners if you rearranged the marriages, right? But they're not, because the higher incomes from both sides are married to each other. So
higher income and higher education, basically.
Yeah, higher income and higher education. So I think that assortative pattern has caused it to still be the case that men are typically the breadwinner, used kind of loosely in the sense of having higher income in the relationships when they exist. But basically, I think across the entire economy, it's not obvious that that's true for younger cohorts. I can think of ways that could be false because marriages have fallen off a cliff. And so if then you want to compare single men and single women, I don't know. There's still a male earnings advantage, but I don't know with the larger rates of male workforce dropout that we've been seeing recently that will be retained. I think if things go at the same rate, that will not be true by like 2030 because the male workforce dropout has been essentially on a linear trend since 2000. I mean, it's remarkable. I don't know that this will continue. I don't know that it can continue. Maybe everyone's lying, maybe the surveys are all wrong. I don't know. But if things continue, this will be the case that the average woman is more likely to be in the workforce than the average man. Although in the last few years, there has also been, I think, a reversal of some of the female workforce labor gains. So for instance, women with long tenures, over 21 years of tenure, that started falling as a fraction of each cohort. So it used to be the case that men had long tenure jobs where they would just be there all the time. and women had very few long tenure jobs. They had, other
Because
kinds of
they were, when
roles.
they start a family, get
Yeah,
pregnant,
yeah,
and they
yeah,
stop
exactly.
working.
And then they were catching up, and now they're both, and men were kind of going down a little bit, and now they're both going down. So it just seems like more and more people don't have this kind of like long-term firm loyalty, or that there's just not that many long-term employment arrangements that are available. So that's related to this work on labor tenures. That it's just no longer the case that there's a lot of like long tenure employees as a fraction of the workforce in the way that there once were in the 1970s. Now the population level number has stayed stable since since the early 2000s. So it might be the case that everything that's like really interesting that happened in labor markets, maybe that all already happened. Maybe it really kind of happened between 1992 and then 2005. And then basically there's not much to record afterwards because we've already entered this period in which the average job tenure is now like 2.5 years. Maybe that's just the way the labor market is now. That's all I can speculate.
All right, so there was this paper that I saw linking automation in certain regions and fertility patterns, and I think it showed that if you had more automation, then the marriage rate decreases, presumably because deindustrialization hits the men much harder, and then they become less desirable marriage partners. But interestingly, their fertility doesn't decline. So that means that the proportion of out of wedlock births is increasing.
Yeah, that
Basically,
was published in Demography. That's, I think, quickly becoming a famous result. And it's become famous because of something that it's a concept sociologists love in crime, the structural invariance hypothesis. And the structural invariance hypothesis is basically that structural shocks that will affect like the races in kind of the same way, that racial crime gaps and things like that are basically the result of kind of structural factors. And I think people believe that something like that's also true when it comes to family structure. And people argue that inner city African Americans were the first to be hit by deindustrialization, frankly, in the 1970s, a long time ago. And that many of those shocks are now becoming just felt by the entire country, such that the entire less educated end of the labor market is facing the same kinds of social problems that were faced by African Americans in the inner city from the 1970s and early 1980s. That's a very common argument, and I think there's certainly something to that, and this paper shows that. So I think that this is going to become a famous result.
yeah, I think the cross-cultural comparison would be very interesting. I mean, I saw a paper once about Japanese society where the capitalism is also in transition, right? So they have more shorter term tenure jobs. They have also some level of deindustrialization, but definitely much shorter job tenure, much more job instability, and that's associated with less marriage. So that would be similar to what we have here in the States, but also less family formation, right? So because in East Asian culture, apparently there's a tight linkage between marriage and family formation, which would be much weaker in perhaps in Western society, which is more, I guess, individualistic. So that's also quite interesting because I mean we know that the Japanese fertility trends are, and also like broadly in East Asia, like South Korea and Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. These are basically the lowest fertility regions in the world, almost, right? So, because in a sense, because of the tight interlinkage between marriage and family formation.
Yeah, people have argued that the only way to increase fertility in these countries is kind of a cultural change that allows the unmarried births to increase. That's what people have argued. I'm not so sure. I know the Japanese fertility within marriage and US fertility within marriage are broadly similar. And also, it's worth pointing out that historical demographers who looked at Japan point out that it seems like there might have been a lot of family breakup and unstable families in Japan in like the 19th century and 18th century. So Japan before modernization is not necessarily the same as Japan after modernization. I'm not a Japanese expert, and I think all these historical records are kind of, you can say a lot with a little. But basically, it wouldn't surprise me if the problem of basically low fertility is not that linked to, I think, economic conditions. I mean, I think people should be kind of skeptical of this. I'll give some examples. Within our society, many of the groups with the highest fertility have very low measured incomes. So I think a little bit about the Amish and high school dropouts and Orthodox Jews. When you look basically at the income fertility gradient, large portions of it, if you try to estimate, imagine like a non-parametric curve where you can estimate from 50 to 70, 70 to 100, so on. Large portions of it seem to be negative. If you look at basically the time series,
could you use like words for non-demographers?
Yeah. So the relationship between income and fertility, and we could call it labor market success and fertility, seems to be negative for many people, many groups of people, where it seems like if they were to have income, that basically there's a negative relationship. And there's debate over that. There's a legitimate debate over whether or not children are what's called a normal good, like to use a more economistic approach, or whether they're a luxury good, where more or less the rich have more of them, or whether they're an inferior good, where the poor are going to have more of them. People argue about that. And my point is not really that it's one or the other, but that the data doesn't make it obvious. And if these effects were really big, they should be visible even in cross sections, right? There would need to be something going on that's interfering with the relationship that would prevent it from being visible in naive analyses. And my understanding is just that the second demographic transition theory is still dominant. And the second demographic transition theory claims that a lot of fertility changes are about changes in ideation, changes in what people want for themselves. It's a change in going from using contraceptives to prevent babies to going off of contraceptives when you want babies. That's the kind of mindset shift that's entailed when people go from the first demographic transition era to the second demographic transition era. And my own belief is that a lot of the fertility issues in these countries are linked more to ideational aspects, individual psychology. To some extent, I think there might be an information problem where people don't understand how difficult it is to have children in your 40s and 50s. I think that there's maybe a small role for policy there. But, if people are beyond that, I would say if people don't want to have that many kids and then they're not having that many kids, the burden, I think, falls on people to show, what the social problem is, basically. Personally, I want to have kids, and that's a challenge and things like that. And if you gave me more money, I'm sure I would have more kids. But many people are not like me. Many people are not like that. So I think that that's kind of the social challenge for social scientists who study fertility, always to show what the issue is. I think there are issues. I think like rural depopulation could be an issue. But then the question becomes, well, why can't you just solve this with immigration? And there's a long article that's like 10,000 words in National Review by Lyman Stone. He's a conservative Lutheran demographer, and he comes up with lists of why you should be pronatal. And, I think that some of them are legitimate, but on the whole, most people I show that to don't find the case like very, very, very strong. So I have my own personal feelings on the matter, but I think most people who look at it say, well, why you could just solve this with immigration, or there's other, like, again, this kind of targeted approach. There's things you could fix that are very specific that would solve this problem. So an interesting problem, for instance, is elder care. If fertility is going down, the ratio of elders to younger people is going to go up. That has to imply that there's a shift in the entire labor market to accommodate that, or that a lot of old people are going to be without elder care. This is a social problem. I think that that's a legitimate reason to think about what we can do about fertility.
Well, I mean, I think on the point of immigration, right? I mean, there's argument by cultural conservatives. I mean, and what we mean by cultural conservatives is basically they want, whites and Christians to be populating this country mostly. And then so that would automatically preclude the favoring immigration as a solution, right?
It could. I don't know. I don't know that it's obvious. For instance, there's a paper that says that basically, if you have more immigration, you have more children. because immigrants take on care roles. So I think that might be that they just have some kind
The
of antipathy.
childcare, you mean
Yeah,
childcare
childcare
position?
roles.
Okay.
So maybe that people just have some kind of antipathy. And I also think that there's a wonderful book by Brian Kaplan that kind of points out that many of the quote unquote problems of immigration are just like solvable. So for instance, people point out that sometimes immigrants will commit crime. Well, that's a totally solvable problem. I mean, like policing and incarceration, people might not like that, but that's a problem that we've known how to solve for like 100 years. And so I don't find those to be compelling arguments against more immigration as a solution to this. I also think that basically, if you look at the actual immigration policy of the US, we take very, very highly educated people and then we force them to leave. Doesn't make any sense. I mean, personally, it doesn't make any sense. I like the idea that, okay, maybe you need to be in the education system for a while. And then after you've gotten your PhD or master's, but then why don't we let you just join the labor market like anyone else? I think that would be a very good thing. And if you look at people make arguments like, well, there's a lot of labor market competition. The people at the Center for Immigration Studies, for instance, have argued that essentially many of the immigrants who get their degrees abroad are less skilled than people who get their degrees in the US. And again, all of these things have like solutions. So for instance, why not let them get their degree in the US? Why not? And then if they get their degree in the US, then you could immediately say, okay, you're allowed to work here if you're very well educated. And as for the labor market competition type of thing, that's, to me, I see that almost as a matter of tax policy. There should be labor market competition. Maybe you want to do something about H-1Bs not being able to leave their particular company. In almost all of these cases, there are like what Brian Kaplan calls keyhole solutions that actually solve the problem. Now, does that mean that open borders is the way to go? I'm maybe more skeptical of that. That could be a big problem. Maybe I'm more linear. Let's try to add 500,000 a year or reach.
Yeah, but there's also the assumption that there's enough native-born people that will take on certain roles in the economy. So, for instance, I mean, we know in agriculture that's definitely false, right? I mean, you have a lot of, let's say, unemployed, local citizens, but they wouldn't necessarily apply to become, orange pickers in Florida.
No, I disagree. I think that it's false of the current wages. I think that wages would rise and then eventually they would take these kinds of jobs. There are cases of that happening. Wages do adjust to match quantities in the labor market just as anywhere else. The question becomes sort of, I think, more what will happen to firms. So the US has an agricultural advantage, and maybe you want this like high levels of labor, of lower cost labor, where it's still to their big advantage to work in these places. That's, I think, been something that's kind of good for the US. One thing that happened, I know on the Texas border that people have told me about, I don't know the scholarly piece of knowledge, but people have told me that there were all these efforts to deport people. And then what happened was essentially all of the illegal and undocumented, rather, immigrant workers were just replaced by legal immigrant workers who were coming in through a particular visa program. And what that suggests to me is that, and they were paid a little bit more. So there is this kind of upward sloping or downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. I do believe in basically the normal supply demand market, like model of labor markets. But as far as advantaging Native Americans go, most people would argue, I think, that it's a very inefficient way. If you want to just advantage Native Americans, you could just pay them money, just give them money. Like Gary Becker, for instance, argued just put a tariff on immigrants. Every immigrant, you come here, you pay $50,000, and then you could just work. And then that way, and the money just goes to Americans on whatever they want. Like you want free healthcare, you can basically finance that with an immigration tariff. And so that's the kind of thing that economists have kind of proposed. And I was ultimately persuaded.
Which to some extent exists, like, because I mean, if you go through that, bureaucratic hurdle of, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, like all the immigration, like lawyer, visa fees, etc.
Yeah, but it exists in a way that it goes to people who are totally unproductive. I mean, I think you believe that the government can be very productive with these resources, certainly more productive than immigration lawyers. So if you do a tariff, boom, it immediately goes to say like free healthcare or Medicare or Medicaid. So I think you would believe basically that that's a productive use of the money. Maybe I would agree with that as well. And that would be more productive than the immigration lawyer and you spending all your time in lines and putting things in the mail and making sure you're getting the mail and doing the procedures exactly. So that would be the kind of reforms that I think that kind of come with the economistic way of looking at this problem, and one that I'm broadly sympathetic to, I would say.
I'm definitely in favor of more immigration. I think, I mean, the net benefit analysis is clearly in the positive, but again, but then there's always this assumption about what is the value that you emphasize. I mean, is it about wealth, GDP, economic development, etc.? Because I mean, if you're like a social conservative, then maybe that's not the most
Yeah, I
important
agree.
value for you.
No, I agree that I think that they would say something like that they have other values, that they have, the right to preserve their values, and they have the right to vote and do those kinds of things. And I agree. I think they do have the right to do those things. And I think that it's a values judgment. I don't begrudge people for wanting to preserve their communities. I think that's it's a legitimate interest, I think. On the other hand, there's other people out there who would die. I mean, many of these people would be in situations of peril, and the opportunity cost is enormous. I mean, in terms of economic growth. So I think there's a clash of values. I think that it's something that there's many ways to resolve. I mean, when you present the normal immigration economics to like regular economists, I think regular people, they always say something like, well, we just keep all the highly educated, and then anyone who's going to be like a net drain on the system, we don't have. And then that's our proposal. That's a very common economistic solution.
Well, but you also need the low-skilled workers, I guess.
Well, they would argue no. They would argue no, because it's
Agricultural
possible
laborers,
basically for people who are highly educated to drop to those positions, and also that would create wage increases for people with less education, so-called low-skill workers with lower wages. That's what people have argued. I think you can find arguments like that in like George Borjas's "We Wanted Workers." I mean, he has a very romantic view, but I think that he would argue that that's the easiest way to redistribute money from a socially conservative perspective to people who are disadvantaged in the current society. In fact, if you're a Republican and you don't want to raise taxes, there's a political economy logic to immigration, which is that if I restrict low-end immigration, I do create some kind of benefits for less skilled workers, and then I don't have to raise taxes. It all happens through the labor and economic system. I think that's a legitimate political economy model that you need to argue is inefficient, or you need to argue that it has some kind of hidden cost and kind of grapple with. That would be something I would put out there.
Right. So that leads us to the next paper about the Immigration Act of 1924, and then you find that there's a drop in crime and the homicide rate. Talk
in
a little
big
bit
cities.
about
In big cities.
Big cities. So what's the intuition there?
Well, what we think is going on, but we're not sure, this is truly preliminary, is that what's happening is that what happens is you cut the flow of immigrants to big cities, and a lot of native-born people from rural areas in the countryside, men especially, leave. And that creates these sex imbalances where basically a lot of these men basically who are maybe in the countryside, maybe they're just more inclined to like commit homicide. So there's these kinds of sex ratio imbalances at the local level that cause homicide to grow up. So what we're trying to increase in this period. So what we're trying to do is,
so if there's too many men in an area, then
there might be too many men in an area, and maybe that would cause problems. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to study. There also might be other problems where the homicide records are not accurate, or it's not exactly the same homicide records. There could also be things, frankly, with like the Italian mafia in particular. They're active, they're a large contributor to homicide at this time. In 1920, immigrants are more likely to be incarcerated, and then after the act, they're less likely to be incarcerated, which suggests that the act kind of changes the composition of who's coming. And one thing that happens immediately after the Immigration Act passes is that most immigrants become female. And before, most immigrants were male. It's total sign flip. You don't see many policy shocks that are like that. Now there's fewer immigrants overall, so you have to grapple with that. And that we argue basically that this changes a lot of the sex ratio in different places. And those changes in the sex ratio are going to lead to higher homicide rates than you would expect. That's kind of in some areas and lower in others. And that's kind of the point of the paper. And this is part of a longer line of research that argues that it's very difficult to estimate effects of immigration on crime because immigrants often have different sex and age characteristics from the native-born population. So Aaron Chalfin, and I think his name is Traeger, have a paper in 2013 where they look at restrictions of Mexican immigration to the US. And they find that basically in the case of Arizona, these restrictions in fact did reduce crime rates. How did they do that? What was actually happening? It just turns out that if you take your population and you take men 15 to 25 and you reduce that number, you will reduce the crime rate. It's a it's a compositional effect. And when you try to look at native-born men versus Mexican men, they're statistically indistinguishable within that age-sex category. And so this tries to, people have used these kinds of results to try to explain other paradoxical results. Sometimes immigrants seem to commit crimes, sometimes they don't. And this kind of line of literature argues that it's all pre-existing demographic facts that we already know about that are mostly uncontroversial about the relationships between age and sex structure and crime. And this literature tries to extend that logic to the 1920s and 30s, looking at how this immigration shock affected men in small towns versus men in the big city.
Yeah, male criminality. I mean, so if you look at the two largest populations in the world, so there's India and China, where I think after 1980, we see a massive shift from like the rough balance was like 106 males to 100 females, but it shifted more towards the male side, right? I think it's like 120 or something.
Yeah.
100 to 100. Yeah, so mechanically, based on what you just said, I mean, we should see the crime rate spiking in those two countries, but is it really the case? I mean,
for India, I'm not sure. For China, they've implemented this kind of mass surveillance state, which I think is fairly effective. Actually, they have many cities where there's no homicide, and I don't know that there was no homicide in 1980. And it's, I think, for the simple reason that everyone is under like constant surveillance, and then you're just put to death. I think if we had that kind of system in the US, there would also be like many cities where there's like totally no homicide. And I just think that that runs into, US culture of privacy, trade-offs, different attitude to the state, different sense of what you want the state to even do, right? In the US, I think that people, the last thing that many, like for instance, residents of Minneapolis would want is to give the police like 100% surveillance powers. So that's my interpretation of Chinese results. And then for India, I'm open to the idea that crime has gone up. I think it's an empirical question. I think it's actually worth investigating.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting. I remember there was a talk by Robert Sampson from Harvard, and he made it like a similar sort of argument based on the empirical data about locations with a lot of immigrants, and then the crime rate tends to be negative, and I think maybe some of it might have to do with the economic situation as well, right? Where like if you're an immigrant, you might be more inclined to move into locations that are, more prosperous, right? And then perhaps there would be less of a need to commit crime in those areas. Yeah. So yeah, like a more dynamic. It would be a much more dynamic economy, right? Where lots of immigrants choose to move into. While it seems to me that like if you have a town where it's like almost all native born, could it be the case that, again, go back to the Linden, New Jersey example, right? Where, like you rely on one factory, but then the factory shuts down and then unemployment increases. And then
I'm realizing I misstated the result earlier. Crime did decline, and it declined in small towns and then stayed about stable in the big city. That's what's going on. That affects the male sex ratio of the towns. I think I said the reverse. earlier in this podcast. Crime did decline in the small towns. That's what's interesting about it. Okay, that clears that up. So hopefully anyone who's listening, see, I wish I could go back and edit. All right, so
Oh,
podcast.
no worries. So there's no
All
editing.
right, let's keep running. So yeah, so what happens when the one factory in your town shuts down? Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic to these kinds of root causes of crime approach. I will say that in the last so there's an interesting story here. In the early 1990s, criminologists said that there were empirical results that said there's no clear relationship between income and crime and policing and crime. And both of those consensuses within criminology have been, I think, almost completely overturned, essentially by economic, by basically better econometric analyses. So to give an example, it turns out that policing is often very mismeasured at the city level. That also turns out to be true of like income. You shouldn't really be using average income. You should be using the income of people who are more inclined to where the opportunity choice between crime and not crime is high, and that's often people who are lower income. So you should be keeping very close track of, say, 20th percentile income. With improvements in measurement like that and conceptual improvements in kind of what we're trying to do with our statistical analyses, people have found much stronger effects for both root causes and policing. I think this is a frustrating thing about criminology, is that it seems like all criminological theories are true. And the kinds of hopes that people had in the 1960s with deviation and kind of these maybe more grand theories, they in fact, I think, believe have found support, along with lots of alternatives that were presented as being mutually exclusive at that time. So I think this is going to be an increasing challenge for social scientists, in the 21st century, is like, what do you do when there's a little bit of support for everything, and none of these things is like 50% of what's going on? They're all 20%, and maybe they add up to something. This, I think,
I have this right-wing friend, and he keeps on sending me articles about, the crime rates in the big cities in America going up, and his favorite, enemy, you could say, is Larry Krasner, who is I think the district attorney in Philadelphia, and right. So like the right wing argument would be, okay, this guy comes in, becomes the district attorney, and then he starts to I don't know, empty the prisons, and basically make sentencing less harsh, and then all of a sudden, the crime rate increases. So I'm not a criminologist, so I don't have like a firm way to analyze that situation. But what's your take on?
I guess my take is your right-wing friend might have some interesting points here. I think that if you it seems to me, I don't know how much Larry Krasner has let people out of prisons, but I've heard many things, like, for instance, the no bail policy. There are murders that can be tied to the no bail policy, where basically this is someone who would have been in prison. They were not in prison because of the no bail policy, and then they've killed someone. The question becomes again is like how.
So what's that policy about, the no bail policy?
Basically that they don't want people to be locked up because they could be fired from their jobs, cut off from their families. So what they do is they allow criminals to, people who've been accused, to re-enter the community and just go about their business until it's time for their trial. And so that's true for things, and they're trying to do that with all crimes, up to assault, basically. And maybe something like that allows people who are not in jail at the time to commit more crimes. It's at least possible. It's, to me, again, this is like an empirical thing that needs to be like looked at very carefully. But on its face, that strikes me as very plausible, that if you let people, if you de-incarcerate, you will have an increase in crime. That just strikes me as very, very plausible. And it becomes a question of the right balance between, the question becomes like, do you want people going in jail for process crimes at all? I think those might be places where decarceration would be very productive. And I think that decarceration for things like violent felonies, that might be
the process crimes. So you're talking about the drug dealing?
Yeah, not just drugs, but like, for instance, lying to a police officer is often, lying to the FBI is a process crime. Resisting arrest is a process crime. Those are crimes that basically in the process of interacting with law enforcement, and I'm not a criminologist, I mean, this is just one demographic paper really, so I'm thinking about it, but basically when you are interacting with law enforcement, there's numerous opportunities for you to get time added to your jail sentence. And so I'm like a little bit skeptical about those. I think that they may not be predictive of future criminal activity, but it's ultimately an empirical question. I think there's other things to be said about more police, less incarceration, for instance. This is something that Alex Tabarrok has proposed, that actually it looks like almost all US cities are under-policed. But I think that a maybe more productive way to think about it is that all these things don't have to go together. I have a friend of mine who was telling me about broken windows policing, and what they don't what often comes up in normal conversations, they think of broken windows as including mass incarceration, as including high levels of policing, as including strict enforcement of like things like graffiti laws and trying to make the neighborhood look beautiful. Really only the third thing is implied by broken windows. And I think unbundling these law enforcement processes and trying to think about, well, what if we had very low levels of incarceration, but we had very high levels of policing? Or what if we did broken windows but no incarceration? Or what if we had lots of incarceration but very little police? I think that might be a more productive way to think about policy in this area, rather than just saying you have to take law enforcement as it is and just accept it, or you have to let everyone out of prison, you have to have no bail policies, you have to make it, I think that there's very specific policies that could be more productive without necessarily increasing the crime rate. But to me, it does seem reasonable that if you try to engage in decarceration and if you try to reduce the police presence on streets, that crime will increase. Certainly, if you do both at the same time, it just seems like from the literature on its face, that seems plausible. But it might be the case that you can pick one or the other, or you can choose policy combinations. And I would encourage people who are interested in this area to think about different policy combinations and see what's out there. So if I can give an example, of course, you could legalize all drugs, but then you could actually probably make the carceral state more intense by having people in there for longer sentences. There's many trade-offs involved in this area. It's very complicated. That's why people do full PhDs in just criminology, because there's a lot to learn here. And but what your friend is saying, just to me, sounds plausible on its face. I don't know if it's true. He could be wrong, but it sounds plausible given the existing literature.
Right. I mean, so another thought I had is, we're always concerned about police violence and, troublesome encounters between the, cops and the public. I was wondering, whether, like liberal gun laws and sort of Second Amendment are also part of that. Because, if I'm a cop in America, I would be much more fearful of encounters with the public, specifically in neighborhoods where a lot of gang violence and shootings are happening.
Yeah.
Right. So for instance, in the UK police, as far as I understand, many of the patrol officers don't even have handguns with them, and then usually, the kind of violence that you're seeing on the streets over there is usually knife crimes, right? It's usually not with handheld weapons, certainly not a semi-automatic rifle. I was wondering, how much of that sort of like concern, trepidation about the police violence has to do with, like basically the widespread private ownership of guns, right?
Could be a lot. It strikes me as plausible that if you were able to really guarantee disarmament of everyone, you would be able to, reduce crime rates. I think the challenge people would bring up would be, well, then only criminals will have guns. And maybe that's true. Maybe there's something to think about. Another thing to think about is there might be gun systems where it needs your fingerprint to fire it. I think that could be like, again, another future of arms in the United States. I'm open to those kinds of things. I think there's also many cases of like, well, maybe I think also state and local policy is very flexible on this. So there's a wide variety of different state and local policies, and there's a wide variety of basically gun law regimes. So econometricians have really studied this. There's dueling results. One set of results is, I believe, by Ian Ayers at Yale. And he basically argues that, no, pretty much if you restrict gun ownership, then the commonsensical result that you'll have less gun violence, that seems true. On the other hand, John Lott, who is at his own think tank, argues, he has a book called More Guns, Less Crime, very interesting book, but he's had some academic problems in the past. He basically argues that there's a lot of statistical illusions in this literature. So I'll give one example. First of all, it's very difficult when people say that, oh, you're most likely to be shot by your friends or by someone you know. Most people interpret that as friends and family. But in fact, the wording of the survey would allow it to include things like gang members, people in a rival gang that you don't like. And those people are also presumably answering the survey. So there's other things, like it seems like there are probably a large number of people, I don't know how, as a fraction of all encounters, who do use guns in self-defense. So there is some, basically, people talk about this concept of deterrence. There's some deterrence effect of guns, and that needs to be, again, balanced against basically all these other costs. In doing that, I just throw it back to the naive empiricist. I think ultimately this is basically an empirical question. And I guess I'm looking forward. I know that there's been a new set of results released as of 2021 that argues that no, the evidence is now overwhelming that guns cause crime and that gun restrictions reduce crime. And I guess I'm looking forward to John Lott's results, or what he'll say to counter it, if anything. I'm very interested in that debate.
Okay, so this is going to be the last point I promised for this podcast. So your paper about inequality trends in capitalism and society, the big claim you make with your co-authors is that education is a good predictor for inequality, and not so much the monopsony power of firms.
True.
And then there's this one sentence towards the end that I want to quote here. So
yeah,
you write, institutional labor market reforms or increasing tax progressivity absent changes in the supply and demand for skilled workers are unlikely to restore 1960s levels of earnings inequality. Which I think it's a very strong thesis, and something that I guess normatively would rebel against, because I like tax systems and labor market structural reforms. So yeah, just state what your finding from that paper and how you came to that.
Yeah, so this is basically a research summary, and the challenge is that monopsonists, there's different challenges here. The taxation, first thing to say, the taxation argument is stronger than the monopsonist argument. But the monopsonists have a hard time explaining very long run inequality trends. So for instance, the 90-10 wage inequality in the 1960s was quite low. It's probably the case that labor market concentration has changed, but actual empirical evaluations that try to relate the size of labor market concentration don't explain a substantial, the increase in inequality. And the bigger the increase in inequality, the harder a time that you would have explaining these theories with monopsony, with changes in firm power relative to workers. That's what I would say about the monopsony theory. The taxation argument is a little bit more subtle, but just when you look at taxes and transfers on net, they've been progressive. So it's kind of a puzzle. People argue that they should be much more progressive, but it's not obvious that this would restore inequality in the sense of raising the wages. I have a very particular meaning, which is in the sense of raising the wages of the less educated in the distribution to be what they would be if they had followed the same trajectory in the 1960s. And I think in that sense, it's a very defensible thing. It's a live argument. Piketty and Sayers are on one side of it. And I think that there are results by Zadar, Zwick, and I forget the other co-author that are on the other side, where they argue that a lot of these inequalities are not easily remediable via taxes. They don't seem like it. So for instance, a lot of capital income actually appears to be labor income. Those kinds of confusions mean that the earlier elasticity estimates, I think, by Piketty and Sayers are open to challenge. And I agree that they're open to challenge. I think that basically these things would not, these things would be extremely costly. I think if they did, they might mechanically reduce equality in the sense of reducing the Gini coefficient, but maybe the juice would not be worth the squeeze, in the sense that basically incomes would go down across the entire distribution. So I think that's the kind of claim that we're making, that the maybe politically sustainable progressive taxes are unlikely to achieve these levels of inequality. You could achieve a level of equality by taxation in a very mechanical way by saying, okay, everyone who earns above $35,000, I tax all of it. That by itself would induce a large amount of inequality. You'd be beyond 1960s. You would be something that we have not seen in the modern world. And you would, by doing that, basically reduce the US's income levels to something that, to very, very low. It would become a less developed country very, very quickly. And that's the kind of claim that I really want to stand by in the paper. That's something that I would stick with.
Right. I mean, well, in policy, I mean, it's never quite like that. I mean, black and white. I don't think anybody would. I mean, unless you're like an absolutely 100% gung ho communist. But I think most people wouldn't go in that direction of like, okay, above a certain tax bracket. I mean, it's like 100%, whatever. So I think that would be extremely harsh. But I mean, wasn't there like, so I mean, you remember in the 1980s, there's this Laffer curve argument.
Yeah,
where,
that's
okay,
separate from the
we don't
equality
want to
thing.
have
But
too much
basically, they're arguing that sometimes you
taxes
can cut the tax rate to raise revenue.
to raise
I think
revenue.
that's a conceptually different just type of debate. I mean, most people I think that we could raise revenue by raising taxes. I think that if your objective is to raise government revenue, then you should just absolutely raise taxes. I think there's like no question about it. And you should probably raise upper income taxes. There might be other trade-offs involved, but that's I think. I don't know if people argue that we're on the left side of the bell curve today for general, top income taxes. I don't know that people argue that. It could still be true for things like corporate income taxes. I'm not sure about that, but I don't think there's a live debate on the personal income side. But I'm not 100% certain, but I would say I'm 90% certain, 95% certain.
Right. So if we had, much higher marginal tax rates, so the highest tax bracket, I mean, wasn't there like a time period, I guess between World War II and maybe, the 1980s when they started to drop that rate substantially, where that also coincided with I guess growing incomes, but across all the deciles in income distribution, because there's certain norms that are encoded, you could say, within the tax system that simply change. I mean, if you drop the top tax rate, then the people who own the capital, they can just say, well, I guess if I can keep most of it in my own pocket, then I will do so.
I'm getting a call from my dentist, so I need to put this on pause. 1 second.
Okay, sure.
All right, let's run it. All right.
Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, about the tax system, that would probably be the last point. I mean, don't you think there would be a normative point to make that if the tax rates are high, then on the richest people, especially on the owners of capital, that they would be more inclined to use it within the company to I don't know, create more jobs or to
right. So in Amazon, there's a good example of that with Amazon, where basically they tax certain types of payouts, and so Amazon has very, very high levels of reinvestment, of firm reinvestment. If you make it so that to realize your gains, basically that's expensive, then what companies will do is they'll never realize their gains, and they'll try to redistribute the gains through wages, including high CEO wages. I mean, that's basically the Amazon story. And Amazon has extremely high reinvestment rates. They're very efficient and so on. And, I mean, there's an argument for this kind of thing. For norms, I'm not sure. I think that if you look at the marginal changes to the top tax rate for personal income, it's not obvious to me that changes norms. Like in the Obama administration, do you feel like in 2012, 2013, CEOs started to become more worker friendly. It's not obvious that there's that kind of variation over the time
Well, but he
series.
shifted from 35 to 39, right? Which
Yeah,
isn't,
it's a
it's
small
not that
change.
much.
So
Yeah.
people might argue that if it were a big change, it would be a much larger response. But normally the way that people investigate things is they try to use these like small changes to look for a small response. That's like the logic of calculus. So what to say about this since the Reagan? So a lot of times people infer basically from the US time series of the Reagan administration that that's what's happening. But there's other time series at the international level. And I'm not sure that the international level supports like this kind of robust relationship between taxes and CEO pays. In Piketty's book, there's basically 3 or 4 countries, because those are the countries where you can get good administrative data. It's like Sweden, France, the US. I think he's looked at maybe others as well, but those are the ones they focuses a lot of attention on. And he does argue that there are these kinds of normative changes that happen as well. And I think ultimately what we need is a much bigger time series, like a much bigger panel data set of tax records and normative changes in things like CEO to worker pay, CEO behaviors, CEO attitudes. There's work on surveying CEOs in Silicon Valley right now. It's being done by a political scientist. I can't remember his name offhand. And what he says is that if you actually talk to CEOs, CEOs are actually not, at least in Silicon Valley, which is now like a huge fraction of the index, they're basically anti-regulation, but they're not necessarily anti-tax. So that seems to be like the emerging, political belief structure. Very, very important elites in the US is that they're much more skeptical of regulatory policy as it's been conducted, but then they're open to like small increases in the personal income tax, probably the corporate income tax as well. The question of whether or not that's Laffer curve efficient, I think, should be kind of separated from the question of what their own beliefs are. But I think that they are not necessarily opposed to that in the way normal people might think. What they are usually opposed to is regulators like outright banning things or coming up with rules that don't make any sense. That's, I think, the Silicon Valley CEO perspective, according to this scientist. So that might be just an emerging perspective, in the 21st century that's held by a lot of CEOs in America. I mean, the other thing to say is that there's kind of a growing internationalization. Many CEOs are now born abroad. They have I would argue that people of this have less attachment to the norms of a particular country, right? That could be a good or bad thing, but it means that the government as basically the norm setter for the entire society, I'm not sure that how attainable that is in a world in which 1/5 of your CEOs were born in, India, China, and, random countries in Europe. They might
And also have like bank accounts outside of the US.
Yeah,
right?
and they have big bank accounts outside the US as well. This is another great reason. Yeah. So I'm not so sure. That might have been something that's true in a closed economy, right? That might have been something where you can have governments set these big norms like in the 1950s because there's simply it's a captive market, and it's a captive media market too, and it's a captive norm market too. People have adopt norms, but they have limited choices. The government says you should do this, and maybe with this broader internationalization, maybe that becomes harder to do. That might be an argument. I'm not sure.
And there was an argument by Wolfgang Streeck, German sociologist, that as soon as you get rid of national capital controls, which it kind of happened like in the mid 80s. I mean, kind of all the countries sort of went that way. Then the sort of national Keynesianism, which was sort of the post-World War II framework in the Western countries, that sort of fell by the wayside, and we're still dealing with the discontents of globalization, more or less, even today. So that's okay. Okay, so we're gonna call this podcast an end. So I thank Michael for spending a lot of his valuable time with me, and
All right. Well, thanks for the
to all my
podcast.
listeners.
Great to see you. Is there something you say at the end of these? Normally people have like catchphrases and stuff like that.
There's no catchphrase. So we'll just
Okay. Well, that's
we'll
a good
just call it
catchphrase.
off. Okay.
There's no
right.
catchphrase.
Okay.
Okay.
All the best.
Great.